Chapter 7C of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Berard. The Sheik by E.M. Hull. Chapter 7C. They were seen by 3 of the Southern patrols this morning, but of course it was nobody's business to find out if they had come back or not. I will start at once, in about 10 minutes. You will come with me? Good. I have sent for reinforcements, who are to follow us if we are not back in 12 hours. His voice was expressionless, and only Raoul de Saint Hubert, who had known him since boyhood, could and did appreciate the significance of a fleeting look that crossed his face as he went back into his tent. For a moment the Vicomte hesitated, but he knew that not even he was wanted inside that empty tent, and a half bitter, half sad feeling that the perfect friendship and confidence that had existed between them for 20 years would never again be the same came to them. The regretful sense of inevitable change, the consciousness of personal relegation. Then fear for Diana drove out every other consideration, and he went to his own quarters with a heavy heart. When he came back in a few minutes, with Henri following him, the camp had undergone a transformation. With the promptness of perfect discipline, the 100 men who had been chosen to go on the expedition were already waiting, each man standing by his horse, and the Sheik, quiet and impassive as usual, was superintending the distribution of extra ammunition. A groom was walking The Hawk slowly up and down, and Yusef, whose gloomy eyes had been fixed reproachfully on his chief, chafing against the order to remain behind to take command of the reinforcements should they be needed, went to him, and took the horse's bridle from him and brought him to the Sheik. Even as he held the stirrup, Saint Hubert could see that he was expostulating with an unusual insistence, begging for permission to accompany them. But the Sheik shook his head, and the young man stood sullenly aside to avoid The Hawk's hoofs as he reared impatiently. Ahmed Ben Hassan motioned Saint Hubert to his side, and in silence the cavalcade started at the usual swift gallop. The silence impressed Raoul, who was accustomed to the Arab's usual clamour. It affected his sensitive temperaments, filling him with a sinister foreboding. The silent band of stern-faced horsemen, riding in close and orderly formation behind them, suggested something more than a mere relief party. The tradition of reckless courage and organized fighting efficiency that had made the tribe known and feared for generations had been always maintained, and under the leadership of the last 2 holders of the hereditary name, to so high a degree that the respect in which it was held was such that no other tribe had ventured to dispute its supremacy, and for many years its serious fighting capacities had not been tested. Even Ibraheim Omair had inherited a feud that was largely traditional. Only once during the lifetime of the last Ahmed Ben Hassan had he dared to come into open conflict, and the memory of it had lasted until now. Skirmishes there had been and would always be inevitably sufficient to keep the tribesmen in a state of perpetual expectancy, and for this Ahmed Ben Hassan preserved the rigid discipline that prevailed in his tribe, insisting on the high standard that had kept them famous. The life work that his predecessor had taken over from his father, the present Ahmed Ben Hassan had carried on and developed with autocratic perseverance. The inborn love of fighting had been carefully fostered in the tribe. The weapons with which they were armed were of the newest pattern. Raoul knew with perfect certainty that to the picked men following them this hasty expedition meant only one thing: war, the war that they had looked forward to all their lives, precipitated now by an accident that gave to a handful of them the chance that hundreds of their fellow tribesmen were longing for, a chance that sent them joyfully behind their chief, careless whether the reinforcements that had been sent for arrived in time or not. The smallness of their numbers was a source of pleasure rather than otherwise. If they won, through to them would be the glory of victory. if they were annihilated with them, would rest the honor of dying with the leader whom they worshipped, for not one of them doubted that Ahmed Ben Hassan would not survive his bodyguard, the flower of his tribe, the carefully chosen men from whose ranks his personal escort was always drawn. With them he would crush his hereditary enemy, or with them he would die. The short twilight had gone and a brilliant moon shone high in the heavens, illuminating the surrounding country with a clear white light. At any other time the beauty of the scene, the glamour of the Eastern night, the headlong gallop in company with his band of fierce fighting men, would have stirred Saint Hubert profoundly. His artistic temperament and his own absolute fearlessness and love of adventure would have combined to make the expedition an exciting experience that he would not willingly have foregone. But the reason for it all, the peril of the girl whom he loved so unexpectedly, changed the whole color of the affair, tinging it with a gravity and a suspense that left a cold fear in his heart. And if to him, what then to the man beside him? The question that Ahmed Ben Hassan had negated so scornfully a week before had been answered differently in the swift look that had crossed his face this evening. He had not spoken since they started, and Saint Hubert had not felt able to break the silence. They had left the level country and were in amongst the long, successive ranges of undulating ground, the summits standing out silver white in the gleaming moonlight, the hollows filled with dark shadow, like black pools of deep, still water. And at the bottom of one of the slopes the Sheik pulled up suddenly with a low, hissing exclamation. A white shape was lying face downwards, spread-eagled on the sand, almost under the Hawk's feet, and at their approach two lean, slinking forms cantered away into the night. The Sheik and Henri reached the still figure simultaneously, and Saint Hubert almost as quickly. He made a hurried examination. The bullet that had stunned Gaston had glanced off, leaving an ugly cut, and others that had hit him at the same time had ploughed through his shoulder, breaking the bone and causing besides wounds that had bled freely. He had staggered more than a mile before he had fainted again from loss of blood. He came to under Saint Hubert's handling, and lifted his heavy eyes to the Sheik, who was kneeling beside him. "Monseigneur, Madame, Ibraheim Omair," he whispered weakly, and relapsed into unconsciousness. For a moment the Sheik's eyes met Raoul's across his body, and then Ahmed Ben Hassan rose to his feet. "Be as quick as you can," he said, and went back to his horse. He leaned against the Hawk, his fingers mechanically searching for and lighting a cigarette, his eyes fixed unseeingly on the group around Gaston. The valet's broken words had confirmed the fear that he had striven to crush since he discovered Diana's absence. He had only seen Ibraheim Omair once, when, 10 years before, he had gone with the elder Ahmed Ben Hassan to a meeting of the more powerful chiefs at Algiers, arranged under the auspices of the French government to confer on a complicated boundary question that had threatened an upheaval amongst the tribes, which the nominal protectors of the country were afraid would be prejudicial to their own prestige, as it would have been beyond their power to quell. He had chafed at having to meet his hereditary enemy on equal terms, and only the restraining influence of the old Sheik, who exacted an unquestioning obedience that extended even to his heir, had prevented a catastrophe that might have nullified the meeting and caused infinitely more complications than the original boundary dispute. But the memory of the robber Sheik remained with him always, and the recollection of his bloated, vicious face and gross, unwieldy body rose clearly before him now. Ibraheim Omair, and the slender daintiness that he had prized so lightly, Diane. His teeth met through the cigarette in his mouth. His senseless jealousy and the rage provoked by Raoul's outspoken criticism had recoiled on the innocent cause. She, not Saint Hubert, had felt the brunt of his anger. In the innate cruelty of his nature it had given him a subtle pleasure to watch the bewilderment, alternating with flickering fear, that had come back into the deep blue eyes that for 2 months had looked into his with frank confidence. He had made her acutely conscious of his displeasure. Only last night, when his lack of consideration and his unwonted irritability had made her wince several times during the evening, and after Saint Hubert had gone to his own tent, he had looked up to find her eyes fixed on him with an expression that, in his dangerous mood, had excited all the brutality of which he was capable, and had filled him with a desire to torture her. The dumb reproach in her eyes had exasperated him, rousing the fiendish temper that had been hardly kept in check all the previous week. And yet, when he held her helpless in his arms, quivering and shrinking from the embrace that was no caress, but merely the medium of his anger, and the reproach in her wavering eyes changed to mute entreaty, the pleasure he had anticipated in her fear had failed him, as it had before, and had irritated him further. The wild beating of her heart, the sobbing intake of her breath, the knowledge of his power over her, gave him no gratification, and he had flung her from him, cursing her savagely, till she had fled into the other room with her hands over her ears to shut out the sound of his slow, deliberate voice. And this morning he had left her without a sign of any kind, no word or gesture that might have effaced the memory of the previous night. He had not meant to. He had intended to go back to her before he finally rode away, but Saint Hubert's refusal to accompany him had killed the softer feelings that prompted him, and his rage had flamed up again. And now? The longing to hold her in his arms, to kiss the tears from her eyes and the color into her pale lips, was almost unbearable. He would give his life to keep even a shadow from her path, and she was in the hands of Ibraheim Omair! The thought and all that it implied was torture, but no sign escaped him of the hell he was enduring. The unavoidable delay seemed interminable, and he swung into the saddle, hoping that the waiting would seem less with the hawk's restless, nervous body gripped between his knees, for though the horse would stand quietly with his master beside him, he fretted continually at waiting once the Sheik was mounted, and the necessity for soothing him was preferable to complete inaction. Saint Hubert rose to his feet at last, and, leaving behind Henri and two Arabs, who were detailed to take the wounded man back to the camp, the swift gallop southward was resumed. On, over the rising and falling ground along which Gaston had stumbled, blind and faint with loss of blood and the pain of his wounds, past the dead body of the dancer, ghostly white in the moonlight, lying a little apart from the semicircle of Arabs that proved their efficiency of Gaston's shooting, where Diana and he had made their last stand. The Sheik made no sign and did not check the headlong gallop, but continued on, the hawk taking the fallen bodies that lay in his path in his stride, with only a quiver of repugnance and a snort of disgust. Still on, past the huddled bundles of tumbled draperies that marked the way significantly, avoiding them where the moonlight illuminated brightly, and riding over them in the deep hollows where once Raoul's horse stumbled badly and nearly fell, recovering himself with a wild scramble, and the Vicomte heard the dead man's skull crack under the horse's slipping hoof. The distant howling of jackals came closer and closer until, topping one long rise and descending into a hollow that was long enough and wide enough to be fully lit by the moon, they came to the place where the ambush had been laid. Instinctively, Ahmed Ben Hassan knew that amongst the jostling heaps of corpses and dead horses lay the bodies of his own men. Perhaps amongst the still forms from which the jackals, whose hideous yelling they had heard, had slunk away, there might be one left with life enough to give some news. One of his own men who would speak willingly, or one of Ibraheim Omair's who would be made to speak. His lips curled back from his white teeth in a grin of pure cruelty. The silence that had prevailed amongst his men broke suddenly as they searched quickly among the dead. The Sheik waited impassively, silent amidst the cluttered imprecations and threats of vengeance of his followers as they laid beside him the six remains of what had been Diana's escort, slashed and mutilated almost beyond recognition. But it was he who noticed that the last terrible figure stirred slightly as it was laid down, and it was into his face, grown suddenly strangely gentle, that the dying Arab looked with fast filming eyes. The man smiled, the happy smile of a child who had obtained an unexpected reward, and raised his hand painfully in salute, then pointed mutely to the south. The Sheik caught his follower's nerveless fingers as they fell in his own strong grasp, and with a last effort the Arab drew his chief's hand to his forehead and fell back dead. End of Section 20, Chapter 7C.
Chapter 8A of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne O'Brien. The Sheik by E.M. Hull. Chapter 8A. Slowly and painfully, through waves of deadly nausea and with the surging of deep waters in her ears, Diana struggled back to consciousness. The agony in her head was excruciating, and her limbs felt cramped and bruised. Recollection was dulled in bodily pain, and at first thought was merged in physical suffering. But gradually the fog cleared from her brain, and memory supervened hesitatingly. She remembered fragmentary incidents of what had gone before the oblivion from which she had just emerged. Gaston, and the horror and resolution in his eyes, the convulsive working of his mouth as he faced her at the last moment. Her own dread, not of the death that was imminent, but lest the mercy it offered should be snatched from her. Then, before the valet could effect his supreme devotion, had come the hail of bullets, and he had fallen against her, the blood that poured from his wounds saturating her linen coat and rolled over across her feet. She remembered vaguely the wild figures hemming her in, but nothing more. Her eyes were still shut, a leaden weight seemed fixed on them, and the effort to open them was beyond her strength. "Gaston," she whispered feebly, and stretched out her hand, but instead of his body or the dry hot sand her fingers had expected to encounter, they closed over soft cushions, and with the shock she sat up with a jerk, her eyes staring wide. But, sick and faint, she fell back again, her arm flung across her face, shielding the light that pierced like daggers through her throbbing eyeballs. For a while she lay still, fighting against the weakness that overpowered her, and by degrees the horrible nausea passed and the agony in her head abated, leaving only a dull ache. The desire to know where she was and what had happened made her forget her bruised body. She moved her arm slightly from before her eyes so that she could see, and looked cautiously from under thick lashes, screened by the sleeve of her coat. She was lying on a pile of cushions in one corner of a small tented apartment which was otherwise bare, except for the rug that covered the floor. In the opposite corner of the tent an Arab woman crouched over a little brazier, and the smell of native coffee was heavy in the air. She closed her eyes again with a shudder. The attempted devotion of Gaston had been useless. This must be the camp of the robber sheik, Ibrahim Omer. She lay still, pressing closely down amongst the cushions, and clenching the sleeve of her jacket between her teeth to stifle the groan that rose to her lips. A lump came into her throat as she thought of Gaston. In those last moments all inequality of rank had been swept away in their common peril. They had been only a white man and a white woman together in their extremity. She remembered how, when she had pressed close to him, his hand had sought and gripped hers, conveying courage and sympathy. All that he could do he had done. He had shielded her body with his own. It must have been over his lifeless body that they had taken her. He had proved his faithfulness, sacrificing his life for his master's plaything. Gaston was in all probability dead, but she was alive, and she must husband her strength for her own needs. She forced the threatening emotion down, and with an effort controlled the violent shivering in her limbs, and sat up slowly, looking at the Arab woman who, hearing her move, turned to gaze at her. Instantly Diana realized that there was no help or compassion to be expected from her. She was a handsome woman who must have been pretty as a girl, but there was no sign of softness in her sullen face and vindictive eyes. Instinctively Diana felt that the glowing menace of the woman's expression was inspired by personal hatred, and that her presence in the tent was objectionable to her, and the feeling gave a necessary spur to the courage that was fast coming back to her. She stared with all the haughtiness she could summon to her aid. She had learned her own power among the natives of India the previous year, and here in the desert there was only one Arab whose eyes did not fall beneath hers. And presently, with a muttered word, the woman turned back to her coffee making. Diana's muscles relaxed, and she sat back easily on the cushions. The little passage of Will's had restored her confidence in herself. She moved her hand, and it brushed against her jacket, coming away stained and sticky, and she noticed for the first time that all one side and sleeve were soaked with blood. She ripped it off with a shudder and flung it from her, rubbing the red smear from her hands with a kind of horror. The little tent was intensely hot, and there was a close, pungent smell that was eminently native, that she had never experienced in the cool airiness and scrupulous cleanliness of Ahmed Ben Hassan's tents. Her sensitive lip curled with disgust, all her innate fastidiousness in revolt. The heat aggravated a burning thirst that was parching her throat. She got up onto her feet slowly and with infinite caution, to prevent any jar that might start again the throbbing in her head. But the effects of the blow were wearing off, and though her head continued to ache, it did no more than that, and the sick, giddy feeling had gone completely. She crossed the tent to the side of the Arab woman. "Give me some water," she said in French, but the woman shook her head without looking up. Diana repeated the request in Arabic, one of the few sentences she knew without stumbling. This time the woman rose up hastily and held out a cup of the coffee she had been making. Diana hated the sweet, thick stuff, but it would do until she could get the water she wanted, and she put out her hand to take the little cup. But her eyes met the other's fixed on her, and something in their malignant stare made her pause. A sudden suspicion shot through her mind. The coffee was drugged. What beyond the woman's expression made her think so, she did not know, but she was sure of it. She put the cup aside impatiently. "No, not coffee, water," she said firmly. Before she realized what was happening, the woman thrust a strong arm round her and forced the cup to her lips. That confirmed Diana's suspicions, and rage lent her additional strength. The woman was strong, but Diana was stronger, younger, and more active. She dashed the cup to the floor, spilling its contents, and with an effort tore the clinging hands from her and sent the woman crashing onto the ground, rolling against the brazier, oversetting it, and scattering brass pots and cups over the rug. The woman scrambled to her knees and beat out the glowing embers, uttering scream after scream in a shrill, piercing voice. And in answer to her cries, a curtain at the side of the tent, that Diana had not noticed, slid aside, and a gigantic Nubian came in. With outstretched hand, shaking with rage, pointing at Diana, she burst into voluble abuse, punctuating every few words with the shrieks that had brought the Negro. Diana could understand nothing of what she had said, but her expressive gestures told the story of the struggle plainly enough. The Nubian listened with white teeth flashing in a broad grin, and shook his head in response to some request urged with denunciatory fist. He picked up the last remaining embers that had scattered on the rug, rubbing the smoldering patches till they were extinguished, and then turned to leave the room. But Diana called him back. She went a step forward, her head high, and looked him straight in the face. "Fetch me water," she said imperiously. He pointed to the coffee that the woman had recommenced to make. Her back turned to them, but Diana stamped her foot. "Water! Bring me water," she said again, more imperiously than before. With a wider grin, the Negro made a gesture of acquiescence and went out, returning in a few moments with a water skin. The thought of its condition made her hesitate for a moment, but only for a moment. Her thirst was too great to allow niceties to interfere with it. She picked up one of the clean coffee cups that had rolled to her feet, rinsed it several times, and then drank. The water was warm and slightly brackish, but she needed it too much to mind. In spite of being tepid, it relieved the dry, suffocating feeling in her throat and refreshed her. The Nubian went away again, leaving the woman still crouching over the brazier. Diana walked back to the cushions and dropped down onto them gladly. The events of the last few moments had tried her more than she realized. Her legs were shaking under her, and she was thankful to sit down. But her courage had risen with a bound. The fact that she was physically stronger than the woman who had been put to guard her, and also that she had gained her point with the burly Negro, had a great moral effect on her, further restoring her confidence in herself. Her position was an appalling one, but hope was strong within her. The fact that she had regained consciousness, she had seen only the woman, and the Nubian seemed to argue that Ibrahim Omair must be absent from his camp. The thought that he might purposely be delaying the moment of inspecting his captive with a view to prolonging her mental torture she put from her as improbable. She did not credit him with so much acumen, and from his absence her courage gained strength. If it could only be prolonged until Ahmed reached her, that the Sheik would come, she knew. Her faith in him was unbounded. If he only came in time. Hours had passed since the ambuscade had surprised them. It had been early afternoon then. Now the lighted lamp told her it was night. How late she did not know. Her watch had been broken some months before, and she had no means of even guessing the hour, but it must be well on in the evening. By now the absence of herself and Gaston and their escort would be discovered. He would know her peril, and he would come to her. Of that she had no doubt. Although he had changed so strangely in the last few days, though the wonderful gentleness of the last 2 months had merged again into indifference and cruelty, still she never doubted. Even if desire had passed, and indifference had become so great that she was no longer necessary to him, still the oriental jealousy with which he was so deeply imbued would never allow him to let her pass so lightly from his keeping. He might discard her at his own pleasure, but no one would take her from him with impunity. Her woman's intuition had sensed the jealousy that had actuated him during the unhappy days since St. Hubert had come, an inconsistent jealousy that had been unprovoked and unjustified, but for which she had suffered. She had known last night when she winced under his sarcastic tongue, and later when St. Hubert had left them, and his temper had suddenly boiled over, that she was paying for the unaccustomed strain that he was putting on his own feelings. His curses had eaten into her heart, and she had fled from him to stifle the coward instinct that urged her to confess her love and beg his mercy. She had lain awake with shivering apprehension, waiting for him, but when, after nearly 2 hours, he had sauntered in, the usual cigarette between his lips, Indifference had taken the place of rage, and he had ignored her, as she had grown used to being ignored. And long after she knew from his even breathing that he was asleep, she had lain wide-eyed beside him, grasping at what happiness she could, living for the moment as she had schooled herself to live, trying to be content with just the fact of his nearness, and the indifference of the night had been maintained when he had left her at dawn, his persistent silence pointing the continuance of his displeasure. But he would come, if for no other reason than the same jealousy which held him in its inexorable grip. He would come. He would come. She whispered it over to herself, as if merely the sound of her words gave her courage. He would not let anything happen to her. Every moment that Ibraheim Omair stayed away was so much gained. Every moment he would be coming nearer. The reversal of the role he played in her life brought a quivering smile to her lips, for the advent of the man who a few weeks before she had loathed for his brutal abduction of herself, she now prayed with the desperation of despair. He represented safety, salvation, everything that made life worth living. A sudden noise and men's voices in the adjoining room sent her to her feet with heaving breast and clenched hands, but the sharp guttural voice predominating over the other voices killed the wild hope that had sprung up in her by its utter dissimilarity to the soft, low tones for which she longed. Ibraheim Omair. He had come first. She set her teeth with a long, shuddering breath, bracing herself to meet what was coming. The Arab woman turned to look at her again with a sneering smile that was full of significance, but beyond a fleeting glance of disdain, Diana paid no attention to her. She stood rigid, one foot beating nervously into the soft rug. She noticed irrelevantly at the moment that both her spurs and the empty holster had been removed whilst she was unconscious, and with the odd detachment that transfers a train of thought from the center of importance even at a supreme moment, she wondered with an annoyance that seemed curiously futile why it had been done. The voices in the next room continued, until Diana almost prayed for the moment she was waiting for would come. Suspense was worse than the ordeal for which she was nerving herself. It came at last. The curtain slid aside again, and the same huge Negro she had seen before entered. He came towards her, and her breath hissed in suddenly between her set teeth. But before he reached her, the Arab woman intercepted him, blocking his way, and with wild eyes and passionate gestures poured out a stream of low, frenzied words. The Nubian turned on her impatiently and thrust her roughly out of his way, and coming to Diana put out his hand as if to grasp her arm, but she stepped back with flashing eyes and a gesture that he obeyed. Her heart was pounding, but she had herself under control. Only her hands twitched, her long fingers curling and uncurling spasmodically, and she buried them deep in her breeches pockets to hide them. She walked slowly to the curtain and nodded to the Nubian to draw it aside, and slower still she passed into the other room, only a little larger than the one she had left, almost as bare, but her mind took in these things uncomprehendingly, for all her attention was focused on the central figure in the room, Ibraheim Omair, the robber sheik, lolling his great bulk on a pile of cushions, a little inlaid stool with coffee beside him, and behind him, standing motionless as if formed of bronze, two other Negroes, so like the one that had summoned her that they seemed like statues that had been cast from one mold. Diana paused for a moment, framed in the entrance, then, with head thrown back and swaggering boyish stride, she moved across the thick rugs leisurely and halted in front of the chief, looking straight at him, with haughty, curling lip and insolent half-closed eyes. The hold she was exercising over herself was tremendous. Her body was rigid with the effort, and her hands, deep down in her pockets, clenched till the nails bit into the palms. Every instinct was rebelling against the calm she forced upon herself. She longed to scream and make a dash for the opening that she guessed was behind her, and to take her chance in the darkness outside. But she knew that such a chance was impossible. If she ever reached the open air, she would never be allowed to get more than a few steps from the tent. Her only course lay in the bravado that alone kept her from collapse. She must convey the impression of fearlessness, though cold terror was knocking at her heart. Masked with indifference, her veiled eyes were watching the robber chief closely. This was, indeed, the Arab of her imaginings, this gross, unwieldy figure lying among the tawdry cushions, his swollen, ferocious face seamed and lined with every mark of vice, his full, sensual lips parted and showing broken, blackened teeth, his deep-set, bloodshot eyes with a look in them that it took all her resolution to sustain, a look of such bestial evilness that the horror of it bathed her in perspiration. His appearance was slovenly. His robes, originally rich, were stained and tumbled. The fat hands lying spread out on his knees were ingrained with dirt, showing even against his dark skin. His heavy face lit up with a gleam of malicious satisfaction as Diana came towards him. His loose mouth broadened in a wicked smile. He leaned forward a little, weighing heavily on the hands that were on his knees, his eyes roving slowly over her till they rested on her face again. End of chapter 8a. Chapter 8b of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne O'Brien. The Sheik by E.M. Hull. Chapter 8b. "So, the white woman of my brother Ahmed Ben Hassan," he said slowly in villainous French, with a sudden, snarling intonation as he uttered his enemy's name. "Ahmed Ben Hassan, may Allah burn his soul in hell," he added with relish, and spat contemptuously. He leaned back on the cushions with a grunt, and drank some coffee noisily. Diana kept her eyes fixed on him, and under their unwavering stare he seemed to be uneasy, his own inflamed eyes wandering ceaselessly over her, one hand fumbling at the curved hilt of a knife stuck in his belt. And at last he grew exasperated, hitching himself forward once more and beckoning her to come nearer to him. She hesitated, and as she paused uncertainly, there was a flutter of draperies behind her, and the Arab woman from the inner room, evading the negro who stepped forward to stop her, flung herself at the feet of Ibrahim Omer, clinging to his knees with a low wailing cry. In a flash Diana realized the meaning of the hatred that had gleamed in the woman's eyes earlier in the evening. To her she was a rival whose coming to share the favors of her lord had aroused all the jealousy of the reigning favorite. A wave of disgust mingled with fear that was torturing her. She jerked her head angrily, fighting against the terror that was growing on her, and for a moment her lashes drooped and hid her eyes. When she looked up again, the woman was still crouched at the old Arab's feet, imploring and distraught. Ibrahim Omer looked down on her curiously, his lips drawn back from his blackened teeth in an evil grin, and then shook her off violently with a swift blow in the mouth. But the woman clung closer with upturned, desperate face, a thin trickle of blood oozing from her lips. And with a hoarse growl that was like the dull roar of a savage beast, the robber chief caught her by the throat and held her for a moment, her frantic, clutching hands powerless against his strong grasp, then slowly drew the long knife from the ample folds of his waistcloth and as slowly drove it home into the strangling woman's breast. With savage callousness, before he released his hold of her, he wiped the stained knife carefully on her clothing and replaced it, and then flung the dead body from him. It rolled over on the rug midway between him and Diana. There was a momentary silence in the room, and Diana became conscious of a muffled, rhythmical beat near her, like the ticking of a great clock, and realized with dull wonder that it was her own heart beating. She seemed turned to stone, petrified with the horror of the last few moments. Her eyes were glued to the still figure on the rug before her, with the gaping wound in the breast, from which blood was welling, staining the dark draperies of the woman's clothes, and creeping slowly down to the rug on which the body lay. She was dazed, and odd thoughts flitted through her mind. It was a pity, she thought stupidly, that the blood should spoil the rug. It was a lovely rug. She wondered what it would have cost in Biskra. Less, probably, than it would in London. Then she forgot the rug as her eyes traveled upward to the woman's face. The mouth was open and the streak of blood was drying, but it was the eyes, protruding, agonized, that brought Diana abruptly to herself. She seemed to wake suddenly to the full realization of what had happened, and to her own peril. She felt physically sick for a moment, but she fought it down. Very slowly she raised her head, and meeting Ibrahim Omer's eyes fixed on her, she looked full at him across the dead woman's body and laughed. It was that or shriek. The curls were clinging, drenched on her forehead, and she wondered if her clenched hands would ever unclose. She must make no sign. She must not scream or faint. She must keep her nerve until Ahmed came. Oh, dear God, send him quickly. The laugh wavered hysterically, and she caught her lip between her teeth. She must do something to distract her attention from that awful still shape at her feet. Almost unconsciously, she grasped the cigarette case in her pocket and took it out, dragging her eyes from the horrible sight on which they were fixed, and chose and lit a cigarette with slow care, flicking the still-burning match onto the carpet between the feet of the Negro who stood near her. He had not moved since he had failed to stop the woman's entrance, and the two stationed behind the pile of cushions had stood motionless, their eyes hardly following the tragedy enacted before them. At a nod from the chief they came now, and carried away the body of the woman. One returned in a moment, bringing fresh coffee, and then vanished noiselessly. Then Ibrahim Omer leaned forward with a horrible leer, and beckoned to Diana, patting the cushion beside him. Mastering the loathing that filled her, she sat down with all the unconcern she could assume. The proximity of the man nauseated her. He reeked of sweat and grease and ill-kept horses, the pungent stench of the native. Her thoughts went back to the other Arab, of whose habits she had been forced into such an intimate knowledge. Remembering all that she had heard of the desert people, she had been surprised at the fastidious care he took of himself. The frequent bathing, the spotless cleanliness of his robes, the fresh wholesomeness that clung about him, the faint, clean smell of shaving soap mingled with the perfume of the Turkish tobacco that was always associated with him. The contrast was hideous. She refused the coffee he offered her with a shake of her head, paying no attention to his growl of protest, not even understanding it, for he spoke in Arabic. As she laid down the end of her cigarette, with almost the feeling of letting go a sheet anchor, for it had at least kept her lips from trembling, his fat hand closed about her wrist, and he jerked her towards him. "How many rifles did the Frenchman bring to that son of darkness?" he said harshly. She turned her head, surprised at the question, and met his bloodshot eyes fixed on hers, half menacing, half admiring, and looked away again hastily. "I do not know." His fingers tightened on her wrist. "How many men had Ahmed Ben Hassan in the camp in which he kept you?" "I do not know." "I do not know! I do not know!" he echoed with a sudden savage laugh. "You will know when I have done with you." He crushed her wrist until she winced with pain, and turned her head further that she might not see his face. Question after question relating to the Sheik and his tribe followed in rapid succession, but to all of them Diana remained silent, with averted head and compressed lips. He should not learn anything from her that might injure the man she loved, though he tortured her, though her life paid the price of her silence, as it probably would. She shivered involuntarily. "Shall I tell you what they would do to him?" She could hear the Sheik's voice plainly as on the night when she had asked him what Gaston's fate would be at the hands of Ibraheim Omair. She could hear the horrible meaning he had put into the words. She could see the terrible smile that accompanied them. Her breath came faster, but her courage still held. She clung desperately to the hope that was sustaining her. Ahmed must come in time. She forced down the torturing doubts that whispered that he might never find her, that he might come too late, that when he came she might be beyond a man's desire. Ibraheim Omair ceased his questioning. "Later you will speak," he said significantly, and drank more coffee, and his words revived the agonizing thoughts she had crushed down. Her vivid imagination conjured up the same ghastly mental pictures that had appalled her when she had applied them to Gaston. But now it was herself who was a central figure in all the horrors she imagined, until the shuddering she tried to suppress shook her from head to foot, and she clenched her teeth to stop them chattering. Ibraheim Omair kept his hold upon her, and presently, with a horrible loathing, she felt his hand passing over her arm, her neck, and down the soft curves of her slim young body. Then, with a muttered ejaculation, he forced her to face him. "What are you listening for? You think that Ahmed Ben Hassan will come? Little fool, he has forgotten you already. There are plenty more white women in Algiers and Oran that he can buy with his gold and his devil face. The loves of Ahmed Ben Hassan are as the stars in number. They come and go like the swift wind in the desert. A hot breath and it's finished. He will not come, and if he does, he will not find you, for in an hour we shall be gone." Diana writhed in his grasp. The hateful words in the guttural voice, pronounced in vile French, the leering, vicious face with a light of admiration growing in the bloodshot eyes, were all a ghastly nightmare. With a sudden, desperate wrench she freed herself and fled across the tent, panic-stricken at last. But in her blind rush she tripped, and with a swiftness that seemed incompatible with his unwieldiness, Ibraheim Omair followed her and caught her in his arms. Struggling, he carried her to the divan. For a moment he paused, and instinctively Diana lay still, reserving her strength for the final struggle. "1 hour, my little gazelle, 1 hour," he said hoarsely, and bent his face to hers. With a cry, Diana flung her head aside and strained away from him, fighting with the strength of madness. She fought like a boy with a swift thought of gratitude for Aubrey's training, and twisting and writhing she managed to slip through his grasp until her feet rested on the ground. But his grip on her never relaxed. He dragged her back to him, resisting fiercely, ripping the thin shirt from her shoulders, baring her white, heaving bosom. Gasping, she struggled again. Little by little his arms closed round her again. She braced her hands against his chest, fending him from her till she felt the muscles in her arms must crack. But the crushing force of his whole weight was bearing her steadily backwards and downwards onto the soft cushions beside them. His hot breath was on her face, the sickening reek of his clothes was in her nostrils. She felt her resistance growing weaker. Her heart was laboring, beating with wild bounds that suffocated her. The strength was going from her arms. Only a moment more and her force would be exhausted. Her brain was growing numbed, as it had been when the man who held her had murdered the woman before her eyes. If he would only kill her now, death would be easy compared with this. The faint hope that still lingered was almost extinguished. Ahmed had not come, and in her agony the thought of him was a further torture. The sneering words of Ibrahim Omer had not shaken her faith. He would come, but he would come too late. He would never know now that she loved him. Oh God, how she loved him! Ahmed, Ahmed! And with the soundless cry the last remnant of her strength went all at once, and she fell weakly against the chief. He forced her to her knees, and with his hand twined brutally in her curls thrust her head back. There was a mad light in his eyes and a foam on his lips as he dragged the knife from his waistband and laid the keen edge against her throat. She did not flinch, and after a moment he dropped it with a horrible laugh. "No, afterwards," he said, and picked her up unresistingly. He flung her on the cushions, and for one awful moment she felt his hands on her. Then from outside came a sudden uproar and a sharp crack of rifles. Then in a lull in the firing the Sheik's powerful voice, "Diane! Diane!" His voice and the knowledge of his nearness gave her new strength. She leaped up in spite of Ibrahim Omer's gripping hands. "Ahmed!" she screamed once. Then the chief's hand dashed against her mouth, but frantic she caught it in her teeth, biting it to the bone, and as he wrenched it away, shrieked again, "Ahmed! Ahmed!" But it seemed impossible that her voice could be heard above the demoniacal noise outside the tent. And she could not call again, for with a snarl of rage the chief caught her by the throat, as he had caught the Arab woman, and like the Arab woman her hands tore at his gripping fingers vainly. Choking, stifling with the agony in her throat, her lungs seemed bursting. The blood was beating in her ears like the deafening roar of waves, and the room was darkening with the film that was creeping over her eyes. Her hands fell powerless to her sides, and her knees gave way limply. He was holding her upright only by the clutch on her throat. The drumming in her ears grew louder. The tent was fading away into blackness. Dimly, with no kind of emotion, she realized that he was squeezing the life out of her, and she heard his voice coming, as it were, from a great distance. "You will not languish long in Hawayat without your lover. I will send him quickly to you." She was almost unconscious, but she heard the sneering voice break suddenly, and the deadly pressure on her throat relaxed as the chief's hands rapidly transferred their grip to her aching shoulders, swinging her away from him and in front of him. To lift her head was agony, and the effort brought back the black mist that had lessened with the slackening of Ibrahim Omer's fingers round her neck, but it cleared again sufficiently for her to see, through a blurring haze, the outline of the tall figure that was facing her, standing by the ripped-back doorway. There was a pause, a silence that contrasted oddly with the tumult outside, and Diana wondered numbly why the Sheik did nothing, why he did not use the revolver that was clenched in his hand. Then slowly she understood that he dared not fire, that the chief was holding her, a living shield before him, sheltering himself behind the only thing that would deter Ahmed Ben Hassan's unerring shots. Cautiously Ibrahim Omer moved backward, still holding her before him, hoping to gain the inner room. But in the shock of his enemy's sudden appearance he miscalculated the position of the divan and stumbled against it, losing his balance for only a moment, but long enough to give the man whose revolver covered him the chance he wanted. With the cold ring of steel pressing against his forehead, the robber chief's hands dropped from Diana, and she slid weak and trembling onto the rug, clasping her pulsating throat, moaning with the effort that it was to breathe. For a moment the two men looked into each other's eyes, and the knowledge of death leapt into Ibrahim Omer's. With the fatalism of his creed he made no resistance, as, with a slow, terrible smile, the Sheik's left hand reached out and fastened on his throat. It would be quicker to shoot, but as Diana had suffered, so should her torturer die. All the savagery in his nature rose uppermost. Beside the pitiful, gasping little figure on the rug at his feet, there was the memory of 6 mutilated bodies, his faithful followers, men of his own age who had grown to manhood with him, picked men of his personal bodyguard who had been intimately connected with him all his life, and who had served him with devotion and unwavering obedience. They and others who had from time to time fallen victims to Ibrahim Omer's hatred of his more powerful enemy. The man who was responsible for their deaths was in his power at last, the man whose existence was a menace and whose life was an offense, of whose subtleties he had been trained from a boy to beware by the elder Ahmed Ben Hassan, who had bequeathed to him the tribal hatred of the race of whom Ibrahim Omer was head, and whose dying words had been the wish that his successor might himself exterminate the hereditary enemy. But far beyond the feelings inspired by tribal hatred, or the remembrance of the vow made 5 years ago beside the old Sheik's deathbed, or even the death of his own followers, was the desire to kill, with his bare hands, the man who had tortured the woman he loved. The knowledge of her peril that had driven him headlong through the night to her aid, the sight of her helpless, agonized, in the robber chief's hands, had filled him with a madness that only the fierce joy of killing would cure. Before he could listen to the clamoring of the new love in his heart, before he could gather up into his arms the beloved little body that he was yearning for, he had to destroy the man whose murders were countless, and who had at last fallen into his hands. The smile on his face deepened, and his fingers tightened slowly on their hold. But with the strangling clasp of Ahmed Ben Hassan's hands upon him, the love of life waked again in Ibrahim Omer, and he struggled fiercely. Crouched on the floor, Diana watched the 2 big figures swaying in mortal combat with wide, fearful eyes, her hands still holding her aching throat. Ibrahim Omer wrestled for his life, conscious of his own strength, but conscious also of the greater strength that was opposed to him. The Sheik let go the hold upon his throat, and with both arms locked about him, maneuvered to get the position he required back to the divan. Then, with a wrestler's trick, he swept Ibrahim's feet from under him, and sent his huge body sprawling onto the cushions, his knees on his enemy's chest, his hands on his throat. With all his weight crushing into the chief's breast, with the terrible smile always on his lips, he choked him slowly to death, till the dying man's body arched and writhed in his last agony, till the blood burst from his nose and mouth, pouring over the hands that held him like a vice. End of chapter 8b. Chapter 8C of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne O'Brien. The Sheik by E.M. Hull. Chapter 8C. Diana's eyes never left the Sheik's face. She felt the old paralyzing fear of him rushing over her, irresistibly drowning, for the moment, even the love she had for him. She had seen him in cruel, even savage moods, but nothing that had ever approached the look of horrible pleasure that was on his face now. It was a revelation of the real man, with the thin layer of civilization stripped from him, leaving only the primitive savage drunk with the lust of blood. And she was afraid, with a shuddering horror, of the merciless, crimson-stained hands that would touch her, of the smiling, cruel mouth that would be pressed on hers, and of the murderous light shining in his fierce eyes. But for the dying wretch expiating his crimes so hideously, she felt no pity. He was beyond all sympathy. She had seen him murder wantonly, and she knew what her own fate would have been if Ahmed Ben Hassan had not come. And the retribution was swift. The Sheik was being more merciful to him than the robber chief had been to many. A few moments of agony instead of hours of lingering torture. The noise outside the tent was growing louder as the fighting rolled back in its direction, and once or twice a bullet ripped through the hangings. One that came closer than the others made Diana turn her head, and she saw what Ahmed Ben Hassan, absorbed in the fulfillment of his horrible task, had not even thought of. The 3 big Negroes and a dozen Arabs who had stolen in silently from the inner room. For once, in the intoxication of the moment, the Sheik was careless and caught off his guard. Agony leaped into her eyes. The fear of him was wiped out in the fear for him. She tried to warn him, but no sound would come from her throbbing throat, and she crawled nearer to him and touched him. He dropped the dead chief back into the tumbled cushions and looked up swiftly. And at the same moment Ibrahim Omer's men made a rush. Without a word he thrust her behind the divan and turned to meet them. Before his revolver they gave way for a moment, but the burly Nubians behind swept the Arabs forward. 3 times he fired, and one of the Negroes and 2 Arabs fell, but the rest hurled themselves on him, and Diana saw him surrounded. His strength was abnormal, and for some minutes the struggling mass of men strained and heaved about him. Diana was on her feet, swaying giddily, powerless to help him, cold with dread. Then above the clamor that was raging inside and out, she heard St. Hubert's voice shouting, and with a shriek that seemed to rip her tortured throat, she called to him. The Sheik too heard, and with a desperate effort for a moment won clear. But one of the Nubians was behind him, and as St. Hubert and a crowd of the Sheik's own men poured in through the opening, he brought down a heavy club with a crashing force on Ahmed Ben Hassan's head, and as he fell another drove a broad knife deep into his back. For a few minutes more the tramping feet surged backward and forward over the Sheik's prostrate body. Diana tried to get to him, faint and stumbling, flung here and there by the fighting, struggling men, until a strong hand caught her and drew her aside. She strained against the detaining arm, but it was one of Ahmed's men, and she gave in as a growing faintness came over her. Mistily she saw St. Hubert clear a way to his friend's side, and then she fainted, but only for a few moments. St. Hubert was still on his knees beside the Sheik when she opened her eyes, and the tent was quite quiet, filled with tribesmen waiting in stoical silence. The camp of Ibrahim Omer had been wiped out, but Ahmed Ben Hassan's men looked only at the unconscious figure of their leader. St. Hubert glanced up hastily as Diana came to his side. "You are all right?" he asked her anxiously, but she did not answer. What did it matter about her? "Is he going to die?" she asked huskily, for speaking still hurt horribly. "I don't know, but we must get away from here. I need more appliances than I have with me, and we are too few to stay and risk a possible attack, if there are others of Ibraheim Omair's men in the neighborhood." Diana looked down on the wounded men fearfully. "But the ride, the jolting!" she gasped. "It has got to be risked," replied St. Hubert abruptly. Of the long, terrible journey back to Ahmed Ben Hassan's camp, Diana never remembered very much. It was an agony of dread and apprehension, of momentary waiting for some word or exclamation from the powerful Arab who was holding him, or from St. Hubert who was riding beside him, that would mean his death, and of momentary respites from fear and faint glimmerings of hope as the minutes dragged past and the word she was dreading did not come. Once a sudden halt seemed to stop her beating heart, but it was only to give a moment's rest to the Arab whose strength was taxed to the uttermost with the Sheik's inert weight, but who refused to surrender his privilege to any other. Moments of semi-unconsciousness, when she swayed against the arm of the watchful tribesman riding beside her, and his muttered ejaculation of "Allah! Allah!" sent a whispered supplication to her own lips, to the God they both worshipped so differently. He must not die. God would not be so cruel. From time to time St. Hubert spoke to her, and the quiet courage of his voice steadied her breaking nerves. As they passed the scene of the ambuscade he told her of Gaston. It was there that the first band of waiting men met them, warned already of their coming by a couple of Arabs whom the Vicomte had sent on in advance with the news. The dawn was breaking when they reached the camp. Diana had a glimpse of rows of unusually silent men grouped beside the tent, but all her mind was concentrated on the long, limp figure that was being carefully lifted down from the sweating horse. They carried him into the tent and laid him on the divan, beside which Henri had already put out all the implements that his master would need. While St. Hubert with difficulty cleared the tent of the Sheik's men, Diana stood beside the divan and looked at him. He was soaked in blood that had burst through the temporary bandages, and his whole body bore evidence of the terrible struggle that had gone before the blow that had felled him. One blood-covered hand hung down, almost touching the rug. Diana lifted it with her own, and the touch of the nerveless fingers sent a sob into her throat. She caught her lip between her teeth to stop it trembling as she laid his hand down on the cushions. St. Hubert came to her, rolling up his shirt sleeves significantly. "Diane, you have been through enough," he said gently. "Go and rest while I do what I can for Ahmed. I will come and tell you as soon as I am finished." She looked up fiercely. "It's no good telling me to go away, because I won't. I must help you. I can help you. I shall go mad if you don't let me do something. See, my hands are quite steady." She held them out as she spoke, and St. Hubert gave in without opposition. The weakness that had sent her trembling into his arms the day before had been the fear of danger to the man she loved, but in the face of actual need the courage that was so much a part of her nature did not fail her. He made no more remonstrances, but set about his work quickly, and all through the horrible time that followed she did not falter. Her face was deadly pale, and dark lines showed below her eyes, but her hands did not shake, and her voice was low and even. She suffered horribly. The terrible wound that the Nubian's knife had made was like a wound in her own heart. She winced as if the hurt had been her own when St. Hubert's gentle, dexterous fingers touched the Sheik's bruised head. And when it was over, and Raoul had turned aside to wash his hands, she slipped onto her knees beside him. Would he live? The courage that had kept her up so far had not extended to asking St. Hubert again, and a few muttered words from Henri, to which the Vicomte had responded with only a shrug, had killed the words that were hovering on her lips. She looked at him with anguished eyes. Only a few hours before he had come to her in all the magnificence of his strength. She looked at the long limbs lying now so still, so terribly, suggestively still, and her lips trembled again, but her pain-filled eyes were dry. She could not cry, only her throat ached and throbbed perpetually. She leaned over him, whispering his name, and a sudden hunger came to her to touch him, to convince herself that he was not dead. She glanced back over her shoulder at Saint Hubert, but he had gone to the open doorway to speak to Yusef, and was standing out under the awning. She bent lower over the unconscious man. His lips were parted slightly, and the usual sternness of his mouth was relaxed. "Ahmed, oh my dear," she whispered unsteadily, and kissed him with lips that quivered against the stillness of his. Then for a moment she dropped her bright head beside the bandaged one on the pillow. But when the Vicomte came back she was kneeling where he had left her, her hands clasped over one of the Sheik's, and her face hidden against the cushions. Saint Hubert put his hand on her shoulder. "Diane, you are torturing yourself unnecessarily. We cannot know for some time how it will go with him. Try and get some sleep for a few hours. You can do no good by staying here. Henry and I will watch. I will call you if there is any change, my word of honor." She shook her head without looking up. "I can't go. I couldn't sleep." Saint Hubert did not press it. "Very well," he said quietly. "But if you are going to stay you must take off your riding boots and put on something more comfortable than those clothes." She realized the sense of what he was saying and obeyed him without a word. She even had to admit to herself a certain sensation of relief after she had bathed her aching head and throat and substituted a thin silk wrap for the torn, stained riding suit. Henry was pouring out coffee when she came back, and Saint Hubert turned to her with a cup in his outstretched hand. "Please take it. It will do you good," he said, with a little smile that was not reflected in his anxious eyes. She took it unheeding and swallowed it hastily, went to the side of the divan again. She slid down onto the rug where she had knelt before. The Sheik was lying as she had left him. For a few moments she looked at him, then drowsily her eyes closed and her head fell forward on the cushions, and with a half-sad smile of satisfaction Saint Hubert gathered her up into his arms. He carried her into the bedroom, hesitating beside the couch before he put her down. Surely one moment out of a lifetime might be granted to him. He would never have the torturing happiness of holding her in his arms again, would never again clasp her against the heart that was crying out for her with the same mad passion that had swept over him yesterday. He looked down longingly on the pale face lying against his arm, and his features contracted at the sight of the cruel marks marring the whiteness of her delicate throat. The love that all his life he had longed for, that he had sought vainly through many countries, had come to him at last, and it had come too late. The helpless loveliness lying in his arms was not for him. It was Ahmed whom she loved, Ahmed who had waked to such a tardy recognition of the priceless gift that she had given him, Ahmed whom he must wrest from the grim spectre that was hovering near him, lest the light that shone in her violet eyes should go out in the blackness of despair. And yet as he looked at her with eyes filled with hopeless misery, a demon of suggestion whispered within him, tempting him. He knew his friend as no one else did. What chance of happiness had any woman with a man like Ahmed Ben Hassan? At the mercy of his savage nature and passionate, changeable moods, what reason to suppose that the love that had flamed up so suddenly at the thought that he had lost her would survive the knowledge of repossession? To him all his life, a thing desired had upon possession become valueless. With the fulfillment of acquisition had come always disinterest. The pleasure of pursuit faded with ownership. Would this hapless girl, who had poured out such a wealth of love at the feet of the man who had treated her brutally, fare any better at his hands? Her chance was slight, if any. Ahmed, in the full power of his strength, again would be the man he had always been, implacable, cruel, merciless. Saint Hubert's own longing, his passionate, Gaelic temperament were driving him as they had driven him the day before. The longing to save her from misery was acute. That and his own love, prompted by the urging of the desire within him. Then he trembled, and a great fear of himself came over him. Ahmed was his friend. Who was he that he should judge him? He could at least be honest with himself. He could own the truth. He coveted what was not his, and masked his envy with a hypocrisy that now appeared contemptible. The clasp of his arm around her seemed suddenly a profanation, and he laid her down very gently on the low couch, drawing the thin coverlet over her, and went back slowly to the other room. He sent Henry away, and sat down beside the divan to watch with a feeling of weariness that was not bodily. The great tent was very still. A pregnant silence seemed to hang in the air, a brooding hush that strained St. Hubert's already overstrained nerves. He had need of all his calm, and he gripped himself resolutely. For a time Ahmed Ben Hassan lay motionless, and then, as the day crept on, and the early rays of the warm sun filled the tent, he moved uneasily, and began to mutter feverishly in confused Arabic and French. At first the words that came were almost unintelligible, pouring out with rapid indistinctness. Then by degrees his voice slowed, and hesitating, interrupted sentences came clearly from his lips, and beside him, with his face buried in his hands, Raoul de Saint Hubert thanked God fervently that he had saved Diana the added torture of listening to the revelations of the past 4 months. The first words were in Arabic, then the slow, soft voice lapsed into French, pure as the Vicomte's own. 2 hours south of the oasis, with the 3 broken palm trees by the well. Lie still, you little fool, it is useless to struggle. You cannot get away, I shall not let you go. Why have I brought you here? You ask me why? Mon Dieu! Are you not woman enough to know? No, I will not spare you. Give me what I want willingly, and I will be kind to you, but fight me, and by Allah, you shall pay the cost. I know you hate me, you have told me so already. Shall I make you love me? Still disobedient? When will you learn that I am master? I have not tired of you yet, you lovely little wild thing. Garçon manque, you say she is cowed, I say she is content, content to give me everything I ask of her. For 4 months she has fought me. Why does it give me no pleasure to have broken her at last? Why do I want her still? She is English, and I have made her pay for my hatred of her cursed race. I have tortured her to keep my vow, and still I want her. Diane, Diane, how beautiful you are! What devil makes me hate Raoul after 20 years? Last night she only spoke to him, and when he went I cursed her till I saw the terror in her eyes. She fears me. Why should I care if she loves him? I knew she was not asleep when I went to her. I felt her quivering beside me. I wanted to kill Raoul when he would not come with me. But for that I would have gone back to her. Allah, how long the day has been! Has it been long to her? Will she smile or tremble when I come? Where is Diane? Diane, Diane, how could I know how much you meant to me? How could I know that I should love you? Diane, Diane, my sunshine, the tent is cold and dark without you. Ibrahim Omeir, that devil and Diane, oh Allah! Grant me time to get to her. How the jackals are howling! See, Raoul, there are the tents. Diane, where are you? Grand Dieu! He has been torturing her. You knew that I would come. Ma bien-aimée, only a few moments while I kill him. Then I can hold you in my arms. Do, if you only knew how much I loved you. Diane, Diane, it is all black. I cannot see you. Diane, Diane. And hour after hour, with weary hopelessness, the tired voice went on, "Diane, Diane." End of chapter 8C.
Chapter 9A of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matt Perard. The Sheik by E.M. Hull. Chapter 9A. It was evening when Diana opened drowsy and heavy eyes, a bitter taste in her mouth from the effects of the drug that Saint Hubert had given her. Everything had been laid out in readiness for her waking, with the little touches that were characteristic of Zélà's handiwork. But the Arab girl herself was not visible. The lamp was lighted, and Diana turned her head languidly, still half confused, to look at the clock beside her. The tiny chime sounded 7 times, and with a rush of recollection she leapt up. More than 12 hours since she had knelt beside him after drinking the coffee that Raoul had given her. She guessed what he had done and tried to be grateful, but the thought of what might have happened during the 12 hours she had lain like a log was horrible. She dressed with feverish haste and went into the outer room. It was filled with Arabs, many of whom she did not recognize, and she knew that they must belong to the reinforcements that Ahmed Ben Hassan had sent for. Two, who seemed from their appearance to be petty chiefs, were talking in low tones to Saint Hubert, who looked worn and tired. The rest were grouped silently about the divan, looking at the still unconscious Sheik. The restlessness and delirium of the morning had passed, and been succeeded by a deathlike stupor. Nearest to him stood Yusuf, his usual swaggering self assurance changed into an attitude of deepest dejection, and his eyes, that were fixed on Ahmed Ben Hassan's face, were like those of a whipped dog. Gradually the tent emptied, until only Yusuf was left, and at last, reluctantly, he too went, stopping at the entrance to speak to Saint Hubert, who had just taken leave of the two headmen. The Vicomte came back, bringing a chair for Diana, and put her into it with gentle masterfulness. "Sit down," he said almost gruffly. "You look like a ghost." She looked up at him reproachfully. "You drugged that coffee, Raoul. If he had died today while I was asleep, I don't think I could ever have forgiven you." "My dear child," he said gravely, "you don't know how near you were to collapse. If I had not made you sleep, I should have had 3 patients on my hands instead of 2." "I am very ungrateful," she murmured, with a tremulous little smile. Saint Hubert brought a chair for himself and dropped into it wearily. He felt very tired. The strain of the past 24 hours had been tremendous. He had a very real fear that was fast growing into a conviction that his skill was going to prove unequal to save his friend's life. And beside that anxiety and his physical fatigue, he had fought a bitter fight with himself all day, tearing out of his heart the envy and jealousy that filled it, and locking away his love as a secret treasure to be hidden for always. His devotion to Ahmed Ben Hassan had survived the greatest test that could be imposed upon it, and had emerged from the trial strengthened and refined, with every trace of self obliterated. It had been the hardest struggle of his life, but it was over now, and all the bitterness had passed, leaving only a passionate desire for Diana's happiness that outweighed every other thought. One spark of comfort remained. He would not be quite useless. His help and sympathy would be necessary to her, and even for that he was grateful. He looked across the divan at her, and the change that the last few hours had made in her struck him painfully. The alert, vigorous boyishness that had been so characteristic was gone. Her slim figure drooping listlessly in the big chair, her white face with the new marks of suffering on it, and her wide eyes burning with dumb misery, were all purely womanly. And yet, though he resented the change, he wished it could have gone further. The restraint she was putting on herself was unnatural. She asked no questions and she shed no tears. He could have borne them both easier than the silent anguish of her face. He feared the results of the emotion she was repressing so rigidly. There was a long silence. Henri came in once, and Diana roused herself to ask for Gaston, and then relapsed into silent watchfulness again. She sighed once, a long, quivering sigh that nearly broke Saint Hubert's heart. He rose and bent over the Sheik with his fingers on his wrist, and as he laid the nerveless hand down again, she leaned nearer and covered it with her own. "His hand is so big for an Arab's," she said softly, like a thought spoken aloud unconsciously. "He is not an Arab," replied Saint Hubert with sudden impatient vehemence. "He is English." Diana looked up at him swiftly with utter bewilderment in her startled eyes. "I don't understand," she faltered. "He hates the English." "Quand même. He is the son of one of your English peers. His mother was a Spanish lady. Many of the old noble Spanish families have Moorish blood in their veins. The characteristics crop up even after centuries. It is so with Ahmed, and his life in the desert has accentuated it. Has he never told you anything about himself?" She shook her head. "Sometimes I have wondered," she said reflectively. "He seemed different from the others, and there has been so much that I could never understand. But then again, there were times when he seemed pure Arab," she added in a lower voice and with an involuntary shiver. "You ought to know," said Saint Hubert. "Yes," he went on firmly, as she tried to interrupt him. "It is due to you. It will explain so many things. I will take the responsibility. His father is the Earl of Glencaryll." "But I know him," said Diana wonderingly. "He was a friend of my father. I saw him only a few months ago when Aubrey and I passed through Paris. He is such a magnificent looking old man, so fierce and sad. Oh, now I know why that awful frown of Ahmed's has always seemed so familiar. Lord Glencaryll frowns like that. It is the famous Caryll scowl. But I still don't understand." She looked from Saint Hubert to the unconscious man on the divan and back to Saint Hubert with a new trouble growing in her eyes. "I had better tell you the whole story," said Raoul, dropping back into his chair. 36 years ago my father, who was as great a wanderer as I am, was staying here in the desert with his friend the Sheik Ahmed Ben Hassan, a chance acquaintance. Some years before, over the purchase of some horses, had ripened into a very intimate friendship that was unusual between a Frenchman and an Arab. The Sheik was a wonderful man, very enlightened, with strong European tendencies. As a matter of pure fact, he was not too much in sympathy with the French form of administration, as carried on in Algeria, but he was not affected sufficiently by it to make any real difficulty. The territory that he regarded as his own lay too much to the south, and he kept his large and scattered tribe in too good order for any interference to be possible. He was unmarried, and the women of his own race seemed to have no attraction for him. He was wrapped up in his tribe and his horses. My father had come for a stay of some months. My mother had recently died, and he wanted to get away from everything that reminded him of her. One evening, shortly after his arrival at the camp, a party of the Sheik's men, who had been absent for some days in the north on the chief's affairs, arrived, bringing with them a woman whom they had found wandering in the desert. How she had got there, or from what direction she had come, they did not know. They were nearer civilization than Ahmed Ben Hassan's camp at the time, but with true native tendency to avoid responsibility, they thought that the disposal of her was a matter more for their Sheik than themselves. She could give no account of herself, as, owing to the effects of the sun or other causes, she was temporarily out of her mind. Arabs are very gentle with anyone who is mad. Allah has touched them. She was taken to the tent of one of the headmen, whose wife looked after her. For some days it was doubtful whether she would recover, and her condition was aggravated by the fact that she was shortly to become a mother. She did regain her senses after a time, however, but nothing could make her say anything about herself, and questions reduced her to terrible fits of hysterical crying, which were prejudicial in her state of health. She seemed calmest when she was left quite alone, but even then she started at the slightest sound, and the headman's wife reported that she would lie for hours on her bed crying quietly to herself. She was quite young, seemingly not more than 19 or 20. From her accents my father decided that she was Spanish, but she would admit nothing, not even her nationality. In due course of time the child was born, a boy. Saint Hubert paused a moment and nodded towards the Sheik. Even after the child's birth she refused to give any account of herself. In that she was as firm as a rock. In everything else she was the frailest, gentlest little creature imaginable. She was very small and slender, with quantities of soft dark hair, and beautiful great dark eyes that looked like a frightened fawn's. I have heard my father describe her many times, and I have seen the watercolor sketch he made of her. He was quite an amateur. Ahmed has it locked away somewhere. She nearly died when the baby was born, and she never recovered her strength. She made no complaint and never spoke of herself, and seemed quite content, as long as the child was with her. She was a child herself in a great number of ways. It never seemed to occur to her that there was anything odd in her continued residence in the Sheik's camp. She had a tent and servants of her own, and the headman's wife was devoted to her. So were the rest of the camp, for that matter. There was an element of the mysterious in her advent that had taken hold of the superstitious Arabs, and the baby was looked upon as something more than human, and was adored by all the tribe. The Sheik himself, who had never looked twice at a woman before in his life, became passionately attached to her. My father says that he has never seen a man so madly in love as Ahmed Ben Hassan was with the strange white girl who had come so oddly into his life. He repeatedly implored her to marry him, and even my father, who has a horror of mixed marriages, was impelled to admit that any woman might have been happy with Ahmed Ben Hassan. She would not consent, though she would give no reason for her refusal, and the mystery that surrounded her remained as insolvable during the 2 years that she lived after the baby's birth as it had been on the day of her arrival. And her refusal made no difference with the Sheik. His devotion was wonderful. When she died, my father was again visiting the camp. She knew that she was dying, and a few days before the end she told them her pitiful little history. She was the only daughter of one of the oldest noble houses in Spain, as poor as they were noble, and she had been married when she was 17 to Lord Glencaryll, who had seen her with her parents in Nice. She had been married without any regard to her own wishes, and though she grew to love her husband, she was always afraid of him. He had a terrible temper that was very easily roused, and, in those days, he also periodically drank a great deal more than was good for him, and when under the influence of drink behaved more like a devil than a man. She was very young and gauche, failing often to do what was required of her from mere nervousness. He was exigent and made no allowance for her youth and inexperience, and her life was one long torture. And yet, in spite of it all, she loved him. Even in speaking of it, she insisted that the fault was hers, that the trouble was due to her stupidity, glossing over his brutality. In fact, it was not from her, but from inquiries that he made after her death, that my father learned most of what her life had been. It seems that Lord Glencaryll had taken her to Algiers, and had wished to make a trip into the desert. He had been drinking heavily, and she did not dare to upset his plans by refusing to go with him, or even by telling him how soon her child was going to be born. So she went with him, and one night something happened. What, she would not say, but my father says he has never seen such a look of terror on any woman's face as she hurried over that part of her story. Whatever it was, she waited until the camp was asleep and then slipped out into the desert, mad with fear, with no thought beyond a blind instinct of flight that drove her panic-stricken to face any danger rather than remain and undergo the misery she was flying from. She remembered hurrying onward, terrified by every sound and every shadow, frightened even by the blazing stars that seemed to be watching her and pointing out the way she had taken, until her mind was numb from utter weariness, and she remembered nothing more until she awoke in the headman's tent. She had been afraid to say who she was lest she should be sent back to her husband, and with the birth of the child she became more than ever determined to preserve her secret. The boy should be spared the suffering she had herself endured. He should not be allowed to fall into the hands of his father, to be at his mercy when the periodical drinking fits made him a very fiend of cruelty. She made my father and the Sheik swear that not until the boy grew to manhood should Lord Glencaryll be told of his existence. She wrote a letter for her husband which she gave into my father's keeping, together with her wedding ring, which had an inscription inside of it, and a miniature of Glencaryll which she had worn always hidden away from sight. She was very contrite with the Sheik, begging his forgiveness for the sorrow she had caused him, and for keeping from his knowledge the fact that she was not free. She loved her husband loyally to the end, but the last few days that she lived the Sheik's devotion seemed to wake an answering tenderness in her heart. She was happiness when he was with her, and she died in his arms with his kisses on her lips. She left her boy in his keeping, and Ahmed Ben Hassan adopted him formally and made him his heir, giving him his own name, the hereditary name that the Sheik of the tribe has borne for generations. His word was law amongst his people, and there was no thought of any opposition to his wishes. Further, the child was considered lucky, and his choice of successor was received with unanimous delight. All the passionate love that the Sheik had for the mother was transferred to the son. He idolized him, and the boy grew up believing that Ahmed Ben Hassan was his own father, with the traits he had inherited from his mother's people, and with his desert upbringing he looked, as he does now, pure Arab. When he was 15 my father induced the Sheik to send him to Paris to be educated. With his own European tendencies, the Sheik had wished it also, but he could not bring himself to part with the boy before, and it was a tremendous wrench to let him go when he did. It was then that I first saw him. I was 18 at the time, and had just begun my military training, but as my regiment was stationed in Paris, I was able to be at home a good deal. He was such a handsome, high spirited lad. Men mature very young in the desert, and in many ways he was a great deal older than I was, in spite of my 3 years' seniority. But of course, in other ways, he was a perfect child. He had a fiendish temper, and resented any check on his natural lawless inclinations. He loathed the restrictions that had to be put upon him, and he hated the restraint of town life. He had been accustomed to having his own way in nearly everything, and to the constant adulation of the tribesmen, and he was not prepared to give to anybody else the obedience that he gave willingly to the Sheik. There were some very stormy times, and I never admired my father in anything so much as his handling of that young savage. His escapades were nerve wracking, and his bourgeois led him into endless scrapes. The only threat that reduced him to order was that of sending him home to the Sheik in disgrace. He would promise amendment and take himself off to the Bois to work off his superfluous energy on my father's horses, until he broke out again. But in spite of his temper and his diableries, he was very lovable and everybody liked him. After a year with us in Paris, my father, always mindful of his real nationality, sent him for 2 years to a tutor in England, where I had myself been. The tutor was an exceptional man, used to dealing with exceptional boys, and Ahmed did very well with him. I don't mean that he did much work. That he evaded skillfully and spent most of his time hunting and shooting. The only thing that he studied at all seriously was veterinary surgery, which he knew would be useful to him with his own horses, and in which his tutor was level-headed enough to encourage him. Then, at the end of 2 years, he came back to us for another year. He had gone to the desert every summer for his holidays, and on each occasion the Sheik let him return with greater reluctance. He was always afraid that the call of civilization would be too much for his adopted son, especially as he grew older. But although Ahmed had changed very much from the wild desert lad who had first come to us, and had developed into a polished man of the world, speaking French and English as fluently as Arabic, with plenty of means to amuse himself in any way that he wished, for the Sheik was very rich and kept him lavishly supplied with money. And though in that last year he was with us, he was courted and fêted in a way that would have turned most people's heads, he was always secretly longing for the time when he would go back to the desert. It was the desert, not civilization, that called loudest to him. He loved the life and he adored the man whom he thought was his father. To be the son and heir of Ahmed Ben Hassan seemed to him to be the highest pinnacle that any man's ambition could reach. He was perfectly indifferent to the flattery and attention that his money and his good looks brought him. My father entertained very largely, and Ahmed became the fashion, le bel Arabe he was called, and he enjoyed a succès fou which bored him to extinction. And at the end of the year, having written to the Sheik for permission to go home, he shook the dust of Paris off his feet and went back to the desert. I went with him. It was my first visit and the first time that I had experienced Ahmed en prince. I had never seen him in anything but European clothes, and I got quite a shock when I came up on deck the morning that we arrived at Oran and found an Arab of the Arabs waiting for me. The robes and a complete change of carriage and expression that seemed to go with them altered him curiously, and I hardly recognized him. Some of his men were waiting for him on the quay and their excitement was extraordinary. I realized from the deference and attention that the French officials paid to Ahmed, the position that the old Sheik had made for himself, and the high esteem in which he was held. We spent the rest of the day in arranging for the considerable baggage that he had brought with him to be forwarded by the camel caravan that had been sent for the purpose, and also in business for the Sheik in Oran. We spent the night in a villa on the outskirts of the town belonging to an old Arab who entertained us lavishly, and who spent the evening congratulating Ahmed heartily on having escaped from the clutches of the odious French, by no means abashed when Ahmed pointed out that there was an odious Frenchman present, for he dismissed me with a gesture that conveyed that my nationality was my misfortune and not my fault, and in impressing on him the necessity of immediately acquiring a wife or two, and settling down for the good of the tribe, all this in the intervals of drinking coffee, listening to the most monotonous native music, and watching barbaric dances. There was one particularly well made dancing girl that the old man tried to induce Ahmed to buy, and he made a show of bargaining for her, not from any real interest he took in her, but merely to see the effect that it would have on me. But I refused to be drawn, and as my head was reeling with the atmosphere, I escaped to bed and left him still bargaining. We started early next morning, and were joined a few miles out of the town by a big detachment of followers. The excitement of the day before was repeated on a very much larger scale. It was a novel experience for me, and I can hardly describe my feelings in the midst of that yelling horde of men, galloping wildly round us and firing their rifles until it seemed hardly possible that some accident would not happen. It was Ahmed's attitude that impressed me most. He took it all quietly as his due, and when he had had enough of it, stopped it with a peremptory authority that was instantly obeyed, and apologized for the exuberant behavior of his children. It was a new Ahmed to me. The boy I had known for 4 years seemed suddenly transformed into a man who made me feel very young. In France I had naturally always rather played elder brother, but here Ahmed was on his own ground and the roles seemed likely to be reversed. The arrival at the Sheik's camp was everything that the most lavish scenic producer could have wished. Though I had heard of it both from my father and Ahmed, I was not quite prepared for the splendor with which the Sheik surrounded himself. With the Eastern luxury was mingled many European adjuncts that added much to the comfort of camp life. The meeting between the Sheik and Ahmed was most touching. I had a very happy time and left with regret. End of chapter 9a. Chapter 9b of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. The Sheik by E.M. Hull. Chapter 9b. The charm of the desert took hold of me then, and has never left me since. But I had to return to my medical studies. I left Ahmed absorbed in his life and happier than I had ever seen him in Paris. He was 19 then, and when he was 21 my father had the unpleasant task of carrying out Lady Glencarryl's dying wishes. He wrote to Lord Glencarryll asking him to come to Paris on business connected with his late wife, and during the course of a very painful interview put the whole facts before him. With the letter that the poor girl had written to her husband, with the wedding ring and the locket, together with the sketch that my father had made of her, the proofs of the genuineness of the whole affair were conclusive. Glencaryll broke down completely. He admitted that his wife had every justification for leaving him. He spared himself nothing. He referred quite frankly to the curse of which he had been the slave, and which had made him irresponsible for his actions when he was under its influence. He had never known himself what had happened that terrible night, but the tragedy of his wife's disappearance had cured him. He had made every effort to find her, and it was many years before he gave up all hope. He mourned her bitterly, and worshipped her memory. It was impossible not to pity him, for he had expiated his fault with agony that few men can have experienced. The thought that he had a son, and that son her child, almost overwhelmed him. He had ardently desired an heir, and, thinking himself childless, the fact that his title, and his old name of which he was very proud, would die with him, had been a great grief. His happiness in the knowledge of Ahmed's existence was pathetic. He was consumed with impatience for his son's arrival. Nothing had been said to Ahmed in case Lord Glencaryll should prove difficult to convince, and thereby complicate matters, but his ready acceptance of the affair, and his eagerness to see his son, made further delay unnecessary, and my father sent for Ahmed. The old Sheik let him go in ignorance of what was coming. He had always dreaded the time when his adopted son would have to be told of his real parentage, fearful of losing him, jealous of sharing his affection, and resenting anybody's claim to him over his own. And so, with the only instance he ever gave of want of moral courage, he sent Ahmed to Paris with no explanation, and left to my father the task of breaking to him the news. I shall never forget that day. It had been arranged that Ahmed should be told first, and that afterwards father and son should meet. Ahmed arrived in the morning in time for déjeuner, and afterwards we went to my father's study, and there he told him the whole story as gently and as carefully as he could. Ahmed was standing by the window. He never said a word the whole time my father was speaking, and when he finished he stood quite still for a few moments, his face almost grey under the deep tan, his eyes fixed passionately on my father's, and then his fiendish temper broke out suddenly. It was a terrible scene. He cursed his father in a steady stream of mingled Arabic and French blasphemy that made one's blood run cold. He cursed all English people impartially. He cursed my father because he had dared to send him to England. He cursed me because I had been a party to the affair. The only person whom he spared was the Sheik, who, after all, was as much implicated as we were, but he never once mentioned him. He refused to see his father, refused to recognize that he was his father, and he left the house that afternoon and Paris that night, going straight back to the desert, taking with him Gaston, who had arranged some time before to enter his service as soon as his time in the cavalry was up. A letter that Lord Glencaryll wrote to him, addressed to Viscount Caryll, which is, of course, his courtesy title, begging for at least an interview, and which he gave to us to forward, was returned unopened, and scrawled across the envelope, "Inconnu, Ahmed Ben Hassan." And since that day his hatred of the English had been a monomania, and he has never spoken a word of English. Later on, when we used to travel together, his obvious avoidance of English people was at times both awkward and embarrassing, and I have often had to go through the farce of translating into French or Arabic remarks made to him by English fellow travellers, that is, when he condescended to notice the remarks, which was not often. From the day he learned the truth about himself for 2 years we saw nothing of him. Then the old Sheik asked us to visit him. We went with some misgivings as to what Ahmed's reception of us would be, but he met us as if nothing had happened. He ignored the whole episode and has never referred to it. It is a closed incident. The Sheik warned us that Ahmed had told him that any reference to it would mean the breaking off of all relations with us. But Ahmed himself had changed indescribably. All the lovable qualities that had made him so popular in Paris were gone, and he had become the cruel, merciless man he has been ever since. The only love left in him was given to his adopted father, whom he worshipped. Later, I was allowed back on the old footing, and he has always been good to Gaston, but with those three exceptions he has spared nobody and nothing. He is my friend, I love him, and I am not telling you more than you know already." Saint Hubert broke off and looked anxiously at Diana, but she did not move or meet his gaze. She was sitting with her hands still clasped over the Sheik's, and the other one shading her face, and the Vicomte went on speaking. "It is so easy to judge, so difficult to understand another person's temptations. Ahmed's position has always been a curious one. He has had unique temptations with always the means of gratifying them." There was a longer pause, but still Diana did not move or speak. The curse of Ishmael had taken hold of me by then, and I wandered continually. Sometimes Ahmed came with me. We have shot big game together in most parts of the globe. A few times he stayed with us in Paris, but never for long. He always wearied to get back to the desert. 5 years ago the old Sheik died. He was an exceptionally strong man, and should have lived for years, but for an accident which crippled him hopelessly, and from which he died a few months afterwards. Ahmed's devotion during his illness was wonderful. He never left him, and since he succeeded to the leadership of the tribe, he has lived continuously amongst his people, absorbed in them and his horses, carrying on the traditions handed down to him by his predecessor, and devoting his life to the tribe. They are like children, excitable, passionate and headstrong, and he has never dared to risk leaving them alone too long, particularly with the menace of Ibraheim Omair always in the background. He has never been able to seek relaxation further afield than Algiers or Oran." Saint Hubert stopped abruptly, cursing himself for a tactless fool. She could not fail to realize the significance of those visits to the gay, vicious little towns. The inference was obvious. His thoughtless words would only add to her misery. Her sensitive mind would shrink from the contamination they implied. If Ahmed was going to die, she would be desolate enough without forcing on her knowledge the unworthiness of the man she loved. He pushed his chair back impatiently and went to the open doorway. He felt that she wanted to be alone. She watched him go, then slipped to her knees beside the couch. She had realized the meaning of Raoul's carelessly uttered words, and they had hurt her poignantly. But it was no new sorrow. He had told her himself, months ago, callously, brutally, sparing her nothing, extenuating nothing. She pressed her cheek against the hand she was holding. She did not blame him. She could only love him, no matter what his life had been. It was Ahmed as he was she loved. His faults, his vices were as much a part of him as his superb physique and the alternating moods that had been so hard to meet. She had never known him otherwise. He seemed to stand alone, outside the prescribed conventions that applied to ordinary men. The standards of common usage did not appear compatible with a wild desert man who was his own law and followed only his own precedent, defiant of social essentials and scornful of criticism. The proud, fierce nature and passionate temper that he had inherited, the position of despotic leadership in which he had been reared, the adulation of his followers, and the savage life in the desert, free from all restraint, had combined to produce the haughty unconventionalism that would not submit to the ordinary rules of life. She could not think of him as an Englishman. The mere accident of his parentage was a factor that weighed nothing. He was and always would be an Arab of the wilderness. If he lived, he must live. He could not go out like that, his magnificent strength and fearless courage extinguished by a treacherous blow that had not dared to meet him face to face, in spite of the overwhelming numbers, but had struck him down from behind, a coward's stroke. He must live, even if his life meant death to her hopes of happiness. That was nothing compared with his life. She loved him well enough to sacrifice anything for him. If he only lived, she could bear even to be put out of his life. It was only he that mattered. His life was everything. He was so young, so strong, so made to live. He had so much to live for. He was essential to his people. They needed him. If she could only die for him. In the days when the world was young, the gods were kind. They listened to the prayers of hapless lovers and accepted the life that was offered in place of the beloved whose life was claimed. If God would but listen to her now, if he would but accept her life in exchange for his, if her fingers crept up lightly across his breast, fearful lest even their tender touch should injure his battered body, and she looked long and earnestly at him. His crisp brown hair was hidden by the bandages that, dead white against his tanned face, swathed his bruised head. His closed eyes with the thick dark lashes curling on his cheek, hiding the usual fierce expression that gleamed in them, and the relaxation of the hard lines of his face made him look singularly young. That youthful look had been noticeable often when he was asleep, and she had watched it wondering what Ahmed the boy had been like before he grew into the merciless man at whose hands she had suffered so much. And now the knowledge of his boyhood seemed to make him even dearer than he had been before. What sort of man would he have been if the little dark-eyed mother had lived to sway him with her gentleness? Poor little mother, helpless and fragile, yet strong enough to save her boy from the danger that she feared for him, but paying the price of that strength with her life, content that her child was safe. Diana thought of her own mother, dying in the arms of a husband who adored her, and then of the little Spanish girl slipping away from life, a stranger in a strange land, her heart crying out for the husband whom she still loved, turning in ignorance of his love for consolation in the agony of death to the lover she had denied, and seeking comfort in his arms. A sudden jealousy of the two dead women shook her. They had been loved. Why could not she be loved? Wherein did she fail that he would not love her? Other men had loved her, and his love was all she longed for in the world. To feel his arms around her only once with love in their touch, to see his passionate eyes kindle only once with the light she prayed for. She drew a long, sobbing breath. "Ahmed, mon bel Arab," she murmured yearningly. She rose to her feet. She was afraid of breaking down, of giving way to the fear and anxiety that racked her. She turned instinctively to the help and sympathy that offered, and went to Saint Hubert, joining him under the awning. Usually at night the vicinity of the Sheik's tent was avoided by the tribesmen. Even the sentry on guard was posted at some little distance. Kopec, curled up outside the doorway, kept ample watch. But tonight the open space was swarming with men, some squatting on the ground in circles, others clustered together in earnest conversation, and far off through the palm trees she caught an occasional glimpse of mounted men. Yusef and the headman acting under him were taking no risks. There was to be no chance of a surprise attack. You must be very tired, Raoul, she said, slipping her hand through his arm, for her need was almost as much for physical as mental support. The frank touch of her hand sent a quiver through him, but he suppressed it, and laid his own hand over her cold fingers. I must not think of that yet. Later on, perhaps, I can rest a little. Henri can watch. He is almost as good a doctor as I am. The incomparable Henri. Ahmed and I have always quarrelled over the respective merits of our servants." He felt her hand tighten on his arm at the mention of the Sheik's name, and heard the smothered sigh that she choked back. They stood in silence for a while watching the shifting groups of tribesmen. A little knot of low-voiced men near them opened up, and one of their number came to Saint Hubert with an inquiry. "The men are restless," Raoul said when the Arab had gone back to his fellows with all the consolation the Vicomte could give him. "Their devotion is very strong. Ahmed is a god to them. Their anxiety takes them in a variety of ways. Yusef, who has been occupied with his duties most of the day, has turned to religion for the first time in his life. He has gone to say his prayers with the pious Abdul, as he thinks that Allah is more likely to listen if his petitions go heavenward in company with the holy man's." Diana's thoughts strayed back to the story that Saint Hubert had told her. "Does Lord Glencaryll know that you see Ahmed?" she asked. "Oh yes. He and my father became great friends. He often stays with us in Paris. We are a link between him and Ahmed. He is always hungry for any news of him and still clings to the hope that one day he will relent. He has never made any further effort to open up relations with him because he knows it would be useless. If there is to be any rapprochement between them, it must come from Ahmed. They have almost met accidentally once or twice, and Glencaryll has once seen him. It was at the opera. He was staying in Paris for some months and had a box. I had gone across from our own box on the other side of the house to speak to him. There were several people with him. I was standing beside him, talking. Ahmed had just come into our box opposite and was standing right in the front, looking over the theatre. Something had annoyed him and he was scowling. The likeness was unmistakable. Glencaryll gave a kind of groan, and staggered back against me. "Good God! Who is that?" he said, and I don't think he knew he was speaking out loud. A man next him looked in the direction he was looking and laughed. "That's the Saint Hubert's wild man of the desert. Looks fierce, doesn't he? The women call him Le Bel Arabe. He certainly wears European clothes with better grace than most natives. He is said to have a peculiar hatred of the English, so you'd better give him a wide berth, Glencaryll, if you don't want to be bowstringed or have your throat cut, or whatever fancy form of death the fellow cultivates in his native habitat. Raoul can tell you all about him." There was not any need for me to tell him. Fortunately the opera began and the lights went down, and I persuaded him to go away before the thing was over. Diana gave a little shiver. She felt a great sympathy coming over her for the lonely old man, hoping against hope for the impossible, that she had not felt earlier in the evening. He too was wearing his heart out against the inflexible will of Ahmed Ben Hassan. She shivered again and turned back into the tent with Saint Hubert. They halted by the couch and stood for a long time in silence. Then Diana slowly raised her head and looked up into Raoul's face, and he read the agonized question in her eyes. "I don't know," he said gently. "All things are with Allah." End of chapter 9b.
Chapter 10a of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.J. Franck. The Sheik by E.M. Hall. Chapter 10A. The night grew hotter and the atmosphere more oppressive. Wrapped in a thin silk kimono, Diana lay very still on the outside of the wide couch in the inner room, propped high with pillows that the shaded light of the little reading lamp beside her might fall on the book she held, but she was not reading. It was Raoul's latest book that he had brought with him, but she could not concentrate her mind on it, and it lay idle on her knee, while her thoughts were far away. It was 3 months since the night that Saint Hubert had almost given up hope of being able to save the Sheik's life, a night that had been followed by days of suspense that had reduced Diana to a weary-eyed shadow of her former vigorous self, and had left marks on Raoul that would never be effaced. But thanks to his great strength and splendid constitution, the Sheik had rallied, and after the first few weeks convalescence had been rapid. When the terrible fear that he might die was past, it had been a wonderful happiness to wait on him. With the determination to live for the moment to which she had forced herself, she had banished everything from her mind but the joy of being near him and of being necessary to him. It had been a very silent service, for he would lie for hours with closed eyes without speaking, and something that she could not master kept her tongue-tied in his presence when they were alone. Only once he had referred to the raid. As she bent over him to do some small office, his fingers closed feebly round her wrist, and his eyes, with a searching apprehension in them, looked into hers for the first time since the night when she had fled from his curses. "Was it in time?" he whispered slowly, and as she nodded with crimson cheeks and lowered eyes, he turned his head away without another word, but a shudder that he was too weak to control shook him. But the happiness of ministering to him passed very swiftly. As he grew stronger he managed so that she was rarely alone with him, and he insisted on her writing twice every day, sometimes with Saint Hubert, sometimes with Henri, coolly avowing a preference for his own society or that of Gaston, who was beginning to get about again. Later, too, he was much occupied with headmen who came in from the different camps, and as the days passed she found herself more and more excluded from the intimacy that had been so precious. She was thrown much into the society of Raoul de Saint Hubert. All that they had gone through together had drawn them very closely to each other, and Diana often wondered what her girlhood would have been like if it had been spent under his guardianship instead of that of Sir Aubrey Mayo. The sisterly affection she had never given her own brother she gave to him, and with the firm hold over himself that he had never again slackened, the Vicomte accepted the role of elder brother which she unconsciously imposed on him. It was hard work sometimes, and there were days when he dreaded the daily rides, when the strain seemed almost more than he could bear, and he began to make tentative suggestions about resuming his wanderings, but always the Sheik pressed him to stay. Ahmed Ben Hassan's final recovery was quick, and the camp soon settled down into normal conditions. The reinforcements were gone back to the different camps from which they had been drawn. There was no further need of them. Ibrahim Omer's tribe, with their leader dead, had broken up and scattered far to the south. There was no chief to keep them together, and no headman strong enough to draw them round a new chieftain, for Ibrahim had allowed no member of his tribe to attain any degree of wealth or power that might prove him a rival. So they had split up into numerous small bands lacking cohesion. In fulfilling the vow made to his predecessor, Ahmed Ben Hassan had cleared the desert of a menace that had hung over it for many years. The relations between the Sheik and St. Aubert had gone back to what they had been the night of Raoul's arrival, before his candid criticism had roused the Sheik's temper and fired his jealousy. The recollection of the miserable week that had preceded the raid had been wiped out in all that had followed it. No shadow could ever come between them again, since Raoul had voluntarily stood on one side and sacrificed his own chance of happiness for his friend's. And with the Sheik's complete recovery his attitude towards Diana had reverted to the cold reserve that had chilled her before, a reserve that was as courteous as it was indifferent. He had avoided her as much as had been possible, and the continual presence of St. Aubert had been a barrier between them. Unostensibly but effectually he had contrived that Raoul should never leave them alone. Though he included her in the general conversation, he rarely spoke to her directly, and often she found him looking at her with his fierce eyes filled with an expression that baffled her, and as each time the quick blood rushed into her face his forehead drew together in the heavy frown that was so characteristic. During meals it was Raoul that kept the conversation from lapsing with ready tact and an eloquent flow of words, ranging over many subjects. In the evening the men became immersed in the projection of St. Aubert's new book, for details of which he was drawing on the Sheik's knowledge, and long after Diana left them she could hear the two voices, both deep and musical, but Raoul's quicker and more emphatic, continuously rising and falling, till at last Raoul would go to his own tent and Gaston would come, noiseless and soft-toned as his master. Ordinarily the Sheik dispensed with him at night, but since his wound the valet, as soon as he had himself recovered, had always been in attendance. Some nights he lingered talking, and others the Sheik dismissed him in a few minutes with only a curt word or two, and then there would be silence, and Diana would bury her face in her pillow and writhe in her desperate loneliness, sick with longing for the strong arms she had once dreaded and the kisses she had once loathed. He had slept in the outer room since his illness, and tossing feverishly on the soft cushions of the big empty bed in which she lay alone, Diana had suffered the greatest humiliation she had yet experienced. He had never loved her, but now he did not even want her. She was useless to him. She was less than nothing to him. He had no need of her. She would lie awake listening wearily to the tiny chimes of the little clock, with the bitter sense of her needlessness crushing her. She was humbled to the very dust by his indifference. The hours of loneliness in the room that was redolent with associations of him were filled with memories that tortured her. In her fitful sleep her dreams were agonies from which she awakened with shaking limbs and shuddering breath, and waking her hand would stretch out groping to him, till remembrance came with cruel vividness. In the daytime, too, she had been much alone, for as soon as the Sheik was strong enough to sit in the saddle, the two men had ridden far afield every day, visiting the outlying camps and drawing into Ahmed Ben Hassan's own hands again the affairs that had had to be relegated to the headmen. At last Raoul had announced that his visit could be protracted no longer, and that he must resume his journey to Morocco. He was going up to Oran and from there to Tangier by coasting steamer, collecting at Tangier a caravan for his expedition through Morocco. His decision once made, he had speeded every means of getting away with a dispatch that had almost suggested flight. To Diana his going meant the hastening of a crisis that could not be put off much longer. The situation was becoming impossible. She had said good-bye to him the night before. She had never guessed the love she had inspired in him, and she wondered at the sadness in his eyes and his unaccustomed lack of words. He had wanted to say so much, and he had said so little. She must never guess, and Ahmed must never guess, so he played the game to the end. Only that night after she had left them the voices sounded in the adjoining room for a very short time, and this morning he and Ahmed Ben Hassan had ridden away at daybreak. She had not been asleep. She had heard them go, and almost she wished Raoul back, for with his presence the vague fear that assailed her seemed further away. The camp had seemed very lonely, and the day very long. She had ridden with Gaston and hurried over her solitary dinner, and since then she had been waiting for the Sheik to come back. In what mood would he come? Since Raoul's announcement of his departure he had been more than usually taciturn and reserved. The book she held slipped at length onto the floor, and she let it be unheeded. The usual stillness of the desert seemed tonight unusually still, sinister even, and the silence was so intense that the sudden squeal of a stallion a little distance away made her start with madly racing heart. Earlier in the evening a tom-tom had been going persistently in the men's lines, and later a native pipe had shrilled thinly in monotonous cadence, but she had grown accustomed to these sounds. They were of nightly occurrence, and they soothed rather than irritated her. And when they stopped, the quiet had become intensified to such a degree that she would have welcomed any sound. Tonight her nerves were on edge. She was restless and excited, and her thoughts were chaos. She was alone again, at his mercy. What would his attitude be? Her hands clenched on her knees. At times she lay almost without breathing, straining to hear the faintest sound that would mean his return, and then again, lest she should hear what she listened for. She longed for him passionately, and at the same time she was afraid. He had changed so much that there were moments when she had the curious feeling that it was a stranger who was coming back to her, and she both dreaded his coming and yearned for it with a singular combination of emotions. She looked round the room where she had at once suffered so much and been so happy, with troubled eyes. She had never been nervous before, but tonight her imagination ran riot. There was electricity in the air which acted on her overstrung nerves. The little shaded lamp threw a circle of light round the bed, but left the rest of the room dim, and the dusky corners seemed full of odd new shadows that came and went elusively. Hangings and objects that were commonly familiar to her took on fantastic shapes that she watched nervously, till at last she brushed her hand across her eyes with a laugh of angry impatience. Was the love that had changed her so completely also making her a coward? Had even her common sense been lost in the one great emotion that held her? She understood perfectly the change that had taken place in her. She had never had illusions about herself, and had never attempted to curb the obstinate self-will and haughty pride that had characterized her. She thought of it curiously, her mind going back over the last few months that had changed her whole life. The last mad freak for which she had paid so dearly had been the outcome of an arrogant determination to have her own way in the face of all protests and advice, and with a greater arrogance and a determination stronger than her own, Ahmed Ben Hassan had tamed her as he tamed the magnificent horses that he rode. He had been brutal and merciless, using no half measures, forcing her to obedience by sheer strength of will and compelling a complete submission. She thought of how she had feared and hated him with passionate intensity until the hatred had been swamped by love as passionate and as intense. She did not know why she loved him. She had never been able to analyze the passion that held her so strongly, but she knew deep down in her heart that it went now far past his mere physical beauty and superb animal strength. She loved him blindly, with a love that had killed her pride and brought her to his feet humbly obedient. All the love that had lain dormant in her heart for years was given to him. Body and soul, she belonged to him, and the change within her was patent in her face. The haughty expression in her eyes had turned to a tender wistfulness, with a curious gleam of expectancy that flickered in them perpetually. The little mutinous mouth had lost the scornful curve, and with the complete change in her expression she was far more beautiful now than she had ever been. But with her love was the fear of him that she had learned during her first hours of her captivity, the physical fear that she had never lost, even during the happy weeks that had preceded the coming of St. Hubert, and the greater fear that was with her always, and that at times drove her, with wide-stricken eyes, wildly to pace the tent as if to escape the shadow that hung over her, the fear of the time when he should tire of her. The thought racked her, and now, as always, she tried to put it from her, but it continued, persistently haunting her like a grim spectre. Always the same thought tortured her. He had not taken her for love. No higher motive than a passing fancy had stirred him. He had seen her, had wished for her, and had taken her. And once in his power it had amused him to break her to his hand. She realized all that. And he had been honest. He had never pretended to love her. Often when the humour took him he could be gentle, as in those last few weeks. But gentleness was not love, and she had never seen the light that she longed for kindle in his eyes. His caresses had been passionate or careless with his mood. She did not know that he loved her. She had not been with him during the long hours of his delirium, and she had not heard what Raoul de Saint Hubert had heard. And since his recovery his attitude of aloofness had augmented her fear. There seemed only one construction to put on his silence, and his studied and obvious avoidance of her. The passing fancy had passed. It was as if the fleeting passion he had had for her had been drained from him with the blood that flowed from the terrible wound he had received. He was tired of her and seeking for a means to disembarrass himself of her. Vaguely she felt that she had known this for weeks, but tonight was the first time that she had had the courage to be frank with herself. It must be so. Everything pointed to it. The curious expression she had seen in his eyes, and his constant heavy frown all confirmed it. She flung her arm across her eyes with a little moan. He was tired of her, and the bottom had fallen out of her world. The instinct to fight for his love that had been so strong in her the day that Ibrahim Omer had captured her had died with the death of all her hopes. Her spirit was broken. She knew that her will was helpless against his, and with a fatalism that she had learned in the desert, she accepted the inevitable with a crushed feeling of hopelessness. She wondered numbly what would become of her. It did not seem to matter much. Nothing mattered now that he did not want her any more. The old life was far away in another world. She could never go back to it. She did not care. It was nothing to her. It was only here in the desert, in Ahmed Ben Hassan's arms, that she had become alive, that she had learned what life really meant, that she had waked both to happiness and sorrow. The future stretched out blank and menacing before her, but she turned from it with a great sob of despair. It was on him that her thoughts were fixed. How would life be endurable without him? Dully she wondered why she did not hate him for having done to her what he had done, for having made her what she was. But nothing that he could do could kill the love now that he had inspired, and she would never regret. She would always have the memory of the fleeting happiness that had been hers. In after years that memory would be all that she would have to live for. Even in her heart she did not reproach him. There was no bitterness in her misery. She had always known that it would come, though she had fenced with it, shutting it out of her mind resolutely. He had never led her to expect anything else. There was no link to bring them closer together, no bond between them. If she could have had the promise of a child. Alone though she was, the sensitive colour flamed into her cheeks, and she hid her face in the pillows with a quivering sob. A child that would be his and hers. A child, a boy with the same passionate dark eyes, the same crisp brown hair, the same graceful body, who would grow up as tall and strong, as brave and fearless as his father. Surely he must love her then. Surely the memory of his own mother's tragic history would make him merciful to the mother of his son. But she had no hope of that mercy. She lay shaking with passionate yearning and the storm of bitter tears that swept over her, hungry for the clasp of his arms, faint with longing. The pent-up misery of weeks that she had crushed down surged over. There was nobody to hear the agonizing sobs that shook her from head to foot. She could relax the control that she had put upon herself, and which had seemed to be slowly turning her to stone. She could give way to the emotion that, suppressed, had welled up choking in her throat and gripped her forehead like red-hot bands eating into her brain. Tears were not easy to her. She had not wept since that first night when, with the fear of worse than death, she had grovelled at his feet, moaning for mercy. She had not wept during the terrible hours she was in the power of Ibraheim Omair, nor during the days that Raoul de Saint Hubert had fought for his friend's life. But tonight, the tears that all her life she had despised would not be denied. Tortured with conflicting emotions, unsatisfied love, fear and uncertainty, utterly unnerved, she gave herself up at last to the feelings she could no longer restrain. Prone on the wide bed, her face buried in the pillows, her hands clutching convulsively at the silken coverings, she wept until she had no more tears, until the anguished sobs died away into silence, and she lay quiet, exhausted. End of chapter 10A. Recording by M.J. Franck, Portland, Oregon. Chapter 10B of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.J. Franck. The Sheik by E.M. Hall. Chapter 10B. She wrestled with herself. The weakness that she had given way to must be conquered. She knew that without any possibility of doubt his coming would seal her fate, whatever it was to be. She must wait until then. A long, shuddering sigh ran through her. Ahmed Ben Hassan, she murmured slowly, lingering with wistful tenderness on the words. She pressed her face closer into the cushions, clasping her hands over her head, and for a long time lay very still. The heat was intense, and every moment the tent seemed to grow more airless. The room was stifling, and with a little groan Diana sat up, pushing the heavy hair off her damp forehead, and covered her flushed face with her hands. A cicada began its shrill note close by, chirping with maddening persistency. Quite suddenly her mind was filled with thoughts of her own people, the old home in England, the family for whose honour her ancestors had been so proudly jealous. Even Aubrey, lazy and self-indulgent as he was, prized the family honour as he prized nothing else on earth. And now she, proud Diana Mayo, who had the history of her race at her fingers' ends, who had gloried in the long line of upright men and chaste women, had no thankfulness in her heart that in her degradation she had been spared a crowning shame. Beside her love everything dwindled into nothingness. He was her life. He filled her horizon. Honour itself was lost in the absorbing passion of her love. He had stripped it from her, and she was content that it should lie at his feet. He had made her nothing. She was his toy, his plaything, waiting to be thrown aside. She shuddered again and looked around the tent that she had shared with him with a bitter smile and sad, hunted eyes. After her, who? The cruel thought persisted. She was torn with a mad primitive jealousy, a longing to kill the unknown woman who would inevitably succeed her, a desire that grew until a horror of her own feelings seized her and she shrank down, clasping her hands over her ears to shut out the insidious voice that seemed actually whispering beside her. The Persian hound in the next room had whined uneasily from time to time, and now he pushed his way past the curtain and stalked across the thick rugs. He nuzzled his shaggy head against her knee, whimpering unhappily, looking up into her face. And when she noticed him, he reared up and flung his long body across her lap, thrusting his wet nose into her face. She caught his head in her hands and rubbed her cheek against his rough hair, crooning over him softly. Even the dog was comfort in her loneliness, and they both waited for their master. She pushed him down at length, and with her hand on his collar went into the other room. A solitary lamp burned dimly. She crossed to the doorway and pulled aside the flap, and a small, white-clad figure rose up before her. "Is that you, Gaston?" she asked involuntarily, though she knew that the question was unnecessary, for he always slept across the entrance to the tent when the Sheik was away. "À votre service, madame." For a few minutes she did not speak, and Gaston stood silent beside her. She might have remembered that he was there. He never stirred far beyond the sound of her voice whenever she was alone in the camp. He was always waiting, unobtrusive, quick to carry out her requests, even to anticipate them. With him standing beside her, she thought of the time when they had fought side by side, all difference in rank eclipsed in their common danger. The servant had been merged into the man, and a man who had the courage to do what he had attempted when he had faced her at what had seemed the last moment, with his revolver clenched in a hand that had not shaken, a man at whose side and by whose hand she would have been proud to die. They were men, these desert dwellers, master and servants alike, men who endured, men who did things, inured to hardships, imbued with magnificent courage, splendid, healthy animals. There was nothing effete or decadent about the men with whom Ahmed Ben Hassan surrounded himself. Diana had always liked Gaston. She had been touched by his unvarying, respectful attitude that had never by a single word or look conveyed the impression that he was aware of her real position in his master's camp. He treated her as if she were indeed what from the bottom of her heart she wished she was. He was solicitous without being officious, familiar with no trace of impertinence. He was Diana's first experience of a class of servant that still lingers in France, a survival of pre-revolutionary days who identify themselves entirely with the family they serve. And in Gaston's case, this interest in his master had been strengthened by experiences shared and dangers faced which had bound them together with a tie that could never be broken, and had raised their relations to a higher plane than that of mere master and man. Those relations had at first been a source of perpetual wonder to Diana. Brought up in the rigid atmosphere of her brother's establishment, where Aubrey's egoism gave no opportunity for anything but conventional service, and in their wanderings, where personal servants had to be often changed, even Stevens was, in Aubrey's eyes, a mere machine. Very soon after she had been brought to Ahmed Ben Hassan's camp, she had realized that Gaston's devotion to the Sheik had been extended to herself. But since the night of the raid he had frankly worshipped her. It was very airless, even out of doors. She peered into the darkness, but there was little light from the tiny crescent moon, and she could see nothing. She moved a few steps forward from under the awning to look up at the brilliant stars twinkling overhead. She had watched them so often from Ahmed Ben Hassan's arms. They had become an integral part of the passionate Oriental nights. He loved them, and when the mood was on him, watched them untiringly, teaching her to recognize them and telling her countless Arab legends connected with them. Sitting under the awning far into the night, till gradually his voice faded away from her ears, and long after she was asleep he would sit on, motionless, staring up into the heavens, smoking endless cigarettes. Would it be given to her ever to watch them again, sparkling against the blue blackness of the sky, with the curve of his arm round her and the steady beat of his heart under her cheek? A stab of pain went through her. Would anything ever be the same again? Everything had changed since the coming of Raoul de Saint Hubert. A weary sigh broke from her lips. "Madame is tired?" a respectful voice murmured at her ear. Diane started. She had forgotten the valet. "It is so hot. The tent was stifling," she said evasively. Gaston's devotion was of a kind that sought practical demonstration. "Madame veut du café?" he suggested tentatively. It was his universal panacea, but at the moment it sounded almost grotesque. Diana felt an hysterical desire to laugh, which nearly turned into tears, but she checked herself. "No, it is too late." "In one little moment I will bring it," Gaston urged persuasively, unwilling to give up his own gratification in serving her. "No, Gaston, it makes me nervous," she said gently. Gaston heaved quite a tragic sigh. His own nerves were steel and his capacity for imbibing large quantities of black coffee at any hour of the day or night unlimited. "Une limonade?" he persisted hopefully. She let him bring the cool drink, more for his pleasure than for her own. "Monseigneur is late," she said slowly, straining her eyes again into the darkness. "He will come," replied Gaston confidently. "Kopec is restless. He is always so when Monseigneur is coming." She looked down for a moment thoughtfully at the dim shape of the hound lying at the man's feet, and then with a last upward glance at the bright stars turned back into the tent. All her nervous fears had vanished in speaking to Gaston, who was the embodiment of practical common sense. Earlier, when unreasoning terror had taken such a hold on her, she had forgotten that he was within call, faithful and devoted. She picked up the fallen book and, lying down again, forced herself to read. But though her eyes followed the lines mechanically, she did not sense what she was reading, and all the time her ears were strained to catch the earliest sound of his coming. At last it came, only a suggestion at first, a wave of thought caught by her waiting brain, an instinctive intuition, and she started up tense with expectancy, her lips parted, her eyes wide, hardly breathing, listening intently. And when he came it was with unexpected suddenness, for in the darkness the little band of horsemen were invisible until they were right on the camp, and the horses' hoofs made no sound. The stir caused by his arrival died away quickly. For a moment there was a confusion of voices, a jingle of accoutrements. One of the horses whinnied, and then in the ensuing silence she heard him come into the tent. Her heart raced suffocatingly. There was a murmur of conversation, the Sheik's low voice and Gaston's quick animated tones answering him, and then the servant hurried out. Acutely conscious of every sound, she waited, motionless, her hands gripping the soft mattress until her fingers cramped, breathing in long, painful gasps as she tried to stop the laboured beating of her heart. In spite of the heat, a sudden coldness crept over her, and she shivered violently from time to time. Her face was quite white, even her lips were colourless, and her eyes, fixed on the curtain which divided the two rooms, glittered feverishly. With her intimate knowledge, every movement in the adjoining room was as perceptible as if she had seen it. He was pacing up and down as he had paced on the night when Gaston's fate was hanging in the balance, as he always paced when he was deliberating anything, and the scent of his cigarette filled her room. Once he paused near the communicating curtain, and her heart gave a wild leap, but after a moment he moved away. He stopped again at the far end of the tent, and she knew from the faint metallic click that he was loading his revolver. She heard him lay it down on the little writing table, and then the steady tramping began once more. His restlessness made her uneasy. He had been in the saddle since early dawn. Saint Hubert had advised him to be careful for some weeks yet. It was imprudent not to rest when opportunity offered. He was so careless of himself. She gave a quick, impatient sigh, and the tender light in her eyes deepened into an anxiety that was half maternal. In spite of his renewed strength and his laughing protests at Raoul's warnings, coupled with a physical demonstration on his less muscular friend that had been very conclusive, she could never forget that she had seen him lying helpless as a child, too weak even to raise his hand. Nothing could ever take the remembrance from her, and nothing could ever alter the fact that in his weakness he had been dependent on her. She had been necessary to him then. She had a moment's fierce pleasure in the thought, but it faded as suddenly as it had come. It had been an ephemeral happiness. At last she heard the divan creak under his weight, but not until Gaston came back bringing his supper. As he ate he spoke, and his first words provoked an exclamation of dismay from the Frenchman, which was hastily smothered with a murmured apology, and then Diana became aware that others had come into the room. He spoke to each in turn, and she recognised Yusef's clear, rather high-pitched voice arguing with the taciturn head camelman, whose surly intonations and behaviour matched the bad-tempered animals to whom he was devoted, until a word from Ahmed Ben Hassan silenced them both. There were two more who received their orders with only a grunt of acquiescence. Presently they went out, but Yusef lingered, talking volubly, half in Arabic, half in French, but lapsing more and more into the vernacular as he grew excited. Even in the midst of her trouble the thought of him sent a little smile to Diana's lips. She could picture him squatting before the Sheik, scented and immaculate, his fine eyes rolling, his slim hands waving continually, his handsome face alight with boyish enthusiasm and worship. At last he too went, and only Gaston remained, busy with the cafetière that was his latest toy. The aroma of the boiling coffee filled the tent. She could imagine the servant's deft fingers manipulating the fragile glass and silver appliance. She could hear the tinkle of the spoon as he moved the cup, the splash of the coffee as he poured it out, the faint sound of the cup being placed on the inlaid table. Why was Ahmed drinking French coffee when he always complained it kept him awake? At night he was in the habit of taking the native preparation. Surely tonight he had need of sleep. It was the hardest day he had had since his illness. For a few moments longer Gaston moved about the outer room, and from the sound Diana guessed that he was collecting onto a tray the various things that had to be removed. Then his voice, louder than he had spoken before. "Monseigneur désire d'autre chose?" The Sheik must have signed in the negative, for there was no audible answer. "Bonsoir, Monseigneur." "Bonsoir, Gaston." Diana drew a quick breath. While the man was still in the adjoining room, the moment for which she was waiting seemed interminable, and now she wished he had not gone. He stood between her and what? For the first time since the coming of Saint Hubert she was alone with him, really alone. Only a curtain separated them, a curtain that she could not pass. She longed to go to him, but she did not dare. She was pulled between love and fear, and for the moment fear was in the ascendant. She shivered and a sob rose in her throat as the memory came to her of another night during those 2 months of happiness that were fast becoming like a wonderful dream, when he had ridden in late. After Gaston left she had gone to him, flushed and bright-eyed with sleep, and he had pulled her down onto his knee and made her share the native coffee she detested, laughing boyishly at her face of disgust. And holding her in his arms with her head on his shoulder, he had told her all the incidents of the day's visit to one of the other camps, and from his men and horses drifted almost insensibly into details connected with his own plans for the future, which were really the intimate confidences of a husband to a wife who was also a comrade. The mingled pain and pleasure of the thought had made her shiver, and he had started up, declaring that she was cold, and lifting her till his cheek was resting on hers, carried her back into the other room. But what she had done then was impossible now. He seemed so utterly strange, so different from the man whom she thought she had grown to understand. She was all at sea. She was desperately tired, her head aching and confused with the terrible problems of the future. She dared not think any more. She only wanted to lie in his arms and sob her heart out against his. She was starving for the touch of his hands, suffering horribly. She slid down onto her knees, burying her face in the couch. "Oh, God, give me his love," she kept whispering in agonized entreaty, until the recollection of the night months before, when in the same posture she had prayed that God's curse might fall on him, sent a shudder through her. "I didn't mean it," she moaned. "Oh, dear God, I didn't mean it. I didn't know. Take it back. I didn't mean it." She choked down the sobs that rose, pressing her face closer into the silken coverings. There was a silence in the next room except for the striking of a match that came with monotonous regularity, and always the peculiar scent of his tobacco drifting in through the heavy curtains, forcing 100 recollections with the association of its perfume. Why didn't he come to her? Did he know how he was torturing her? Was he so utterly indifferent that he did not care what she suffered? Did he even think of her to wonder if she suffered or not? The fear of the future rushed on her again with overwhelming force. The uncertainty was killing her. She raised her head and looked at the travelling clock beside the reading lamp. It was an hour since Gaston had left him. Another hour of waiting would drive her mad. She must know what he was going to do. She could bear anything but this suspense. She had reached the limit of her endurance. She struggled to her feet, drawing the thin wrap closer around her, but even then she stood irresolute, dreading the fulfilling of her fears. She had not the courage voluntarily to precipitate her fate. She clung to her fool's paradise. Her eyes were fixed on the clock, watching the hands drag slowly round the dial. A quarter of an hour crept past. It seemed the quarter of a lifetime, and Diana brushed her hand across her eyes to clear away the dazzling reflection of the staring white china face with its long black minute hand. No sound of any kind came now from the other room. The silence was driving her frantic. She was desperate. She must know. Nothing could be worse than the agony she was enduring. She set her teeth and, crossing the room, slipped noiselessly between the curtains. Then she shrank back suddenly with her hands over her mouth. He was leaning forward on the divan, his elbows on his knees, his face hidden in his hands, and it was as a stranger that he had come back to her, divested of the flowing robes that had seemed essentially a part of him, an unfamiliar figure in silk shirt, riding breeches, and high brown boots, still dust-covered from the long ride. A thin tweed coat lay in a heap on the carpet. He must have flung it off after Gaston went, for the valet, with his innate tidiness, would never have left it lying on the floor. End of chapter 10b. Recording by M.J. Franck, Portland, Oregon. Chapter 10c of The Sheik. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.J. Franck. The Sheik by E.M. Hall. Chapter 10c. She looked at him hungrily, her eyes ranging slowly over the long length of him and lingering on his bent head. The light from the hanging lamp shone on his thick brown hair, burnishing it like bronze. She was shaking with a sudden new shyness, but love gave her courage, and she went to him, her bare feet noiseless on the rugs. "Ahmed," she whispered. He lifted his head slowly and looked at her, and the sight of his face sent her onto her knees beside him, her hands clutching the breast of his soft shirt. "Ahmed, what is it? You are hurt? Your wound?" she cried, her voice sharp with anxiety. He caught her groping hands and, rising, pulled her gently to her feet, his fingers clenched round hers, looking down at her strangely. Then he turned from her without a word, and, wrenching open the flap of the tent, flung it back and stood in the open doorway staring out into the night. He looked oddly slender and tall, silhouetted against the darkness, A gleam of perplexity crept into her frightened eyes, and one hand went up to her throat. "What is it?" she whispered again breathlessly. "It is that we start for Oran to-morrow," he replied. His voice sounded dull and curiously unlike, and with a little start Diana realized that he was speaking in English. Her eyes closed and she swayed dizzily. "You are sending me away?" she gasped slowly. There was a pause before he answered. "Yes." The curt monosyllable lashed her like a whip. She reeled under it, panting and wild-eyed. "Why?" He did not answer, and the colour flamed suddenly into her face. She went closer to him, her breast heaving, trying to speak, but her throat was parched and her lips shaking so that no words would come. "It is because you are tired of me?" she muttered at last hoarsely. "As you told me you would tire, as you tired of those other women?" Her voice died away with an accent of horror in it. Again he did not answer, but he winced, and his hands that were hanging at his sides clenched slowly. Diana flung one arm across her face to shut him out from her sight. Her heart was breaking, and she longed with a feeling of sick misery to crawl to his feet, but a remnant of pride kept her back. He spoke at length in the same level, toneless voice. "I will take you to the first desert station outside of Oran, where you can join the train. For your own sake I must not be seen with you in Oran, as I am known there. If you should by any chance be recognized, or your identity should leak out, you can say that for reasons of your own you extended your trip, that your messages miscarried, anything that occurs to you. But it is not at all likely to happen. There are many travellers passing through Oran. Gaston can do all business and make all arrangements for you. He will take you to Marseille, and if you need him he will go with you to Paris, Cherbourg, or London, whichever you wish. As you know, you can trust him absolutely. When you do not need him any longer, he will come back to me. I will not trouble you any more. You need never be afraid that I will come into your life again. You can forget these months in the desert and the uncivilized Arab who crossed your path. To keep out of your way is the only amends I can make." She flung up her head. Quick, suspicious jealousy and love and pride contending nearly choked her. "Why don't you speak the truth?" she cried wildly. "Why don't you say what you really mean? That you have no further use for me, that it amused you to take me and torture me to satisfy your whim, but the whim is past. It does not amuse you any longer. You are tired of me, and so you get rid of me with all precautions. Do you think the truth can hurt me? Nothing that you can do can hurt me now. You made me the vile thing I am for your pleasure, and now for your pleasure you throw me on one side. How many times a year does Gaston take your discarded mistresses back to France?" Her voice broke into a terrible laugh. He swung round swiftly and flung his arms about her, crushing her to him savagely, forgetting his strength, his eyes blazing. "God, do you think it is easy to let you go, that you are taunting me like this? Do you think I haven't suffered, that I am not suffering now? Don't you know that it is tearing my heart out by the roots to send you away? My life will be hell without you. Do you think I haven't realized what an infinitely damned brute I've been? I didn't love you when I took you. I only wanted you to satisfy the beast in me. And I was glad that you were English, that I could make you suffer as an Englishman made my mother suffer, so I loathed the whole race. I have been mad all my life, I think, up till now. I thought I didn't care until the night I heard that Ibrahim Omer had got you. And then I knew that if anything happened to you, the light of my life was out, and that I would only wait to kill Ibrahim before I killed myself." His arms were like a vice hurting her, but they felt like heaven, and she clung to him speechless, her heart throbbing wildly. He looked down long and deeply into her eyes, and the light in his, the light that she had longed for, made her tremble. His brown head bent lower and lower, and his lips had almost touched her when he drew back, and the love in his eyes faded into misery. "I mustn't kiss you," he said huskily, as he put her from him gently. "I don't think I should have the courage to let you go if I did. I didn't mean to touch you." He turned from her with a little gesture of weariness. Fear fled back into her eyes. "I don't want to go," she whispered faintly. He paused by the writing table and took up the revolver he had loaded earlier, breaking it absently, spinning the magazine between his finger and thumb, and replaced it before answering. "You don't understand. There is no other way," he said dully. "If you really loved me, you would not let me go," she cried with a miserable sob. "If I loved you," he echoed with a hard laugh. "If I loved you. It is because I love you so much that I am able to do it. If I loved you a little less, I would let you stay and take your chance." She flung out her hands appealingly. "I want to stay, Ahmed. I love you," she panted, desperate, for she knew his obstinate determination, and she saw her chance of happiness slipping away. He did not move or look at her, and his brows drew together in the dreaded, heavy frown. "You don't know what you are saying. You don't know what it would mean," he replied in a voice from which he had forced all expression. "If you married me, you would have to live always here in the desert. I cannot leave my people, and I am too much of an Arab to let you go alone. It would be no life for you. You think you love me now, though God knows how you can after what I have done to you, but a time would come when you would find that your love for me did not compensate for your life here. And marriage with me is unthinkable. You know what I am and what I have been. You know that I am not fit to live with, not fit to be near any decent woman. You know what sort of a damnable life I have led. The memory of it would always come between us. You would never forget. You would never trust me. And if you could, of your charity, both forgive and forget, you know that I am not easy to live with. You know my devilish temper. It has not spared you in the past. It might not spare you in the future. Do you think that I could bear to see you year after year growing to hate me more? You think that I am cruel now, but I am thinking what is best for you afterwards. Some day you will think of me a little kindly because I had the strength to let you go. You are so young, your life is only just beginning. You are strong enough to put the memory of these last months out of your mind, to forget the past and live only for the future. No one need ever know. There can be no fear for your reputation. Things are forgotten in the silence of the desert. Mustafa Ali is many hundreds of miles away. but not so far that he would dare to talk. My own men need not be considered. They speak or are silent as I wish. There's only Raoul, and there's no question of him. He has not spared me his opinion. You must go back to your own country, to your own people, to your own life, in which I have no place or part, and soon all this will seem only like an ugly dream." The sweat was standing out on his forehead and his hands were clenched with the effort he was making. But her head was buried in her hands, and she did not see the torture in his face. She only heard his soft, low voice inexorably decreeing her fate and shutting her out from happiness in quiet, almost indifferent tones. She shuddered convulsively. "Ahmed, I go," she wailed. He looked up sharply, his face livid, and tore her hands from her face. "Good God, you don't mean... I haven't... You aren't..." he gasped hoarsely, looking down at her with a great fear in his eyes. She guessed what he meant, and the colour rushed into her face. The temptation to lie to him and let the consequences rest with the future was almost more than she could resist. One little word and she would be in his arms. But afterwards... It was the fear of the afterwards that kept her silent. The colour slowly drained from her face and she shook her head mutely. He let go her wrists with a quick sigh of relief and wiped the perspiration from his face. Then he laid his hand on her shoulder and pushed her gently towards the inner room. For a moment she resisted, her wide, desperate eyes searching his, but he would not meet her look, and his mouth was set in the hard, straight line she knew so well. And with a cry she flung herself on his breast, her face hidden against him, her hands clinging round his neck. "Ahmed, Ahmed, you are killing me. I cannot live without you. I love you and I want you, only you. I am not afraid of the loneliness of the desert. It is the loneliness of the world outside the shelter of your arms that I am afraid of. I am not afraid of what you are or what you have been. I am not afraid of what you might do to me. I never lived until you taught me what life was, here in the desert. I can't go back to the old life, Ahmed. Have pity on me. Don't shut me out from my only chance of happiness. Don't send me away. I know you love me. I know. And because I know, I am not ashamed to beg you to be merciful. I haven't any shame or pride left. Ahmed, speak to me. I can't bear your silence. Oh, you are cruel, cruel." A spasm crossed his face, but his mouth set firmer and he disengaged her clinging hands with relentless fingers. "I have never been anything else," he said bitterly, "but I am willing that you should think me a brute now rather than you should live to curse the day you ever saw me. I still think that your greater chance of happiness lies away from me rather than with me, and for your ultimate happiness I am content to sacrifice everything." He dropped her hands and turned abruptly, going back to the doorway, looking out into the darkness. "It is very late. We must start early. Go and lie down," he said gently, but it was an order in spite of the gentleness of his voice. She shrank back trembling, with piteous, stricken face and eyes filled with a great despair. She knew him, and she knew it was the end. Nothing would break his resolution. She looked at him with quivering lips through a mist of tears, looked at him with a desperate fixedness that sought to memorize indelibly his beloved image in her heart. The dear head so proudly poised on the broad shoulders, The long, strong limbs, the slender, graceful body. He was all good to look upon, a man of men. Monseigneur, Monseigneur, mon maître et seigneur. No, it would never be that any more. A rush of tears blinded her, and she stepped back uncertainly and stumbled against the little writing table. She caught at it behind her to steady herself, and her fingers touched the revolver he had laid down. The contact of the cold metal sent a chill that seemed to strike her heart. She stood rigid, with startled eyes fixed on the motionless figure in the doorway, one hand gripping the weapon tightly and the other clutching the silken wrap across her breast. Her mind raced forward feverishly. There were only a few hours left before the morning, before the bitter moment when she must leave behind her forever the surroundings that had become so dear, that had been her home, as the old castle in England had never been. She thought of the long journey northward, the agonized protraction of her misery riding beside him, the nightly camps when she would lie alone in the little travelling tent, and then the final parting at the wayside station when she would have to watch him wheel at the head of his men and ride out of her life. And she would strain her eyes through the dust and sand to catch the last glimpse of the upright figure on the spirited black horse. It would be the hawk, she thought suddenly. He had ridden Shaitan today, and he always used one or other of the two for long journeys. It was the hawk he had ridden the day she had made her bid for freedom, and who had carried the double burden on the return journey when she had found her happiness. The contrast between that ride when she had lain content in the curve of his strong arm and the ride that she would take the next day was poignant. She closed her teeth on her trembling lip. Her fingers tightened on the stock of the revolver, and a wild light came into her sad eyes. She could never go through with it. To what end would be the hideous torture? What was life without him? Nothing, and less than nothing. She could never give herself to another man. She was necessary to no one. Aubrey had no real need of her. His selfishness wrapped him around with a complacency that abundantly satisfied him. One day, for the sake of the family, he would marry, perhaps was already married, if he had been able to find a woman in America who would accept his egoism along with his old name and possessions. Her life was her own to deal with. Nobody would be injured by its termination. Aubrey, indeed, would benefit considerably. And he... His figure was blurred through the tears that filled her eyes. Slowly, she lifted the weapon clear of the table with steady fingers and brought her hand stealthily from behind her. She looked at it for a moment dispassionately. She was not afraid. She was conscious only of an overwhelming weariness, a longing for rest that should still the gnawing pain in her breast and the throbbing in her head. A flash, and it would be over, and all her sorrow would melt away. But would it? A doubting fear of the hereafter rushed over her. What if suffering lived beyond the borderline? But the fear went as suddenly as it had come, for with it came remembrance that in that shadowy world she would find one who would understand, her own father, who had shot himself, mad with heart-broken despair, when her mother died in giving her birth. She lifted the revolver to her temple resolutely. There had been no sound to betray what was passing behind him, but the extra sense, the consciousness of imminent danger that was strong in the desert-bred man, sprang into active force within the Sheik. He turned like a flash and leaped across the space that separated them, catching her hand as she pressed the trigger, and the bullet sped harmlessly an inch above her head. With his face gone suddenly ghastly, he wrenched the weapon from her and flung it far into the night. For a moment they stared into each other's eyes in silence. Then with a moan she slipped from his grasp and fell at his feet in an agony of terrible weeping. With a low exclamation he stooped and swept her up into his arms, holding her slender, shaking figure with tender strength, pressing her head against him, his cheek on her red gold curls. "My God, child, don't cry so. I can bear anything but that," he cried brokenly. But the terrible sobs went on, and fearfully he caught her closer, straining her to him convulsively, raining kisses on her shining hair. "Diane, Diane," he whispered imploringly, falling back into the soft French that seemed so much more natural. "Mon amour, ma bien-aimée, ne pleure pas. Je t'en prie. Je t'aime, je t'adore. Tu resteras près de moi, tout à moi." She seemed only half conscious, unable to check the emotion that unloosed, overwhelmed her. She lay inert against him, racked with the long, shuddering sobs that shook her. His firm mouth quivered as he looked down at his work. Gathering her up to his heart, he carried her to the divan, and the weight of her soft, slim body sent the blood racing madly through his veins. He laid her down and dropped on his knees beside her, his arm wrapped round her, whispering words of passionate love. Gradually the terrible shuddering passed, and the gasping sobs died away, and she lay still, so still and white that he was afraid. He tried to rise to fetch some restorative, but at the first movement she clung to him, pressing closer to him. "I don't want anything but you," she murmured almost inaudibly. His arm tightened round her and he turned her face up to his. Her eyes were closed and the wet lashes lay black against her pale cheek. His lips touched them pitifully. "Diane, will you never look at me again?" His voice was almost humble. Her eyes quivered a moment and then opened slowly, looking up into his with a still lingering fear in them. "You won't send me away," she whispered pleadingly, like a terrified child. A hard sob broke from him, and he kissed her trembling lips fiercely. "Never," he said sternly. "I will never let you go now. My God, if you knew how I wanted you, if you knew what it cost me to send you away. Pray God I keep you happy. You know the worst of me, poor child. You will have a devil for a husband." The colour stole back slowly into her face, and a little tremulous smile curved her lips. She slid her arm up and round his neck, drawing his head down. "I am not afraid," she murmured slowly. "I am not afraid of anything with your arms round me, my desert lover. Ahmed, mon seigneur." End of chapter 10C and end of The Sheik by E.M. Hall. Recording by M.J. Franck, Portland, Oregon.